You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that together you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern. It is November 18th, and it's time now for headlines. Let's get into them. First up in COVID news. Yesterday in the United States, there were 114,000 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,603 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 88,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 23% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has now been fully vaccinated. 69% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,390,000 people across the United States. It has killed 766,206 people. By the way, yeah, the cases are on the rise again. I don't know what that means, but we've been doing the yo-yo thing. And last year, I want to look at the curves. The curves in terms of seasons don't match last year. It just full stop, basically. Yeah. But it seems like we're doing more of a yo-yoing thing than we were, where, it kind of makes sense. Both with the vaccines now being in full effect and with the lockdowns not being in full effect. Last year we had it went up really quickly and then down really quickly too, for a while there. And then it got pretty low as lockdowns were implemented, and then it kind of, popped back up. My point is both the troughs and the peaks are lower this time, and it seems to me like it might be oscillating faster. I don't know what that means.
Well, it seems like at one point it looks like we were turning the corner, and then at that point people were like, "Oh, we don't need our masks." People got their vaccine, everything is good, we can go back to normal. It was that kind of thing, in which case the numbers just skyrocketed back up during Biden's term. I don't know. It does feel like a yo-yo. It feels like it's not going anywhere. It drops down to, I don't know, maybe 18 or 1,100, and then bounces back up to 2,000, 1,100, 2,000.
Yes.
I don't know if that's just because we've gotten better at managing it from the standpoint of hospitalization and everything else, where you have less people dying. I'm not sure. It seems like we're just kind of still spreading it, though.
I don't know. I do not know. I'm just noticing it, and especially because, of course, cases are going back up. They had been declining for a while, and in the last couple of weeks, they've started to go back up. In national news, the House of Representatives voted Wednesday to approve a resolution that censures Representative Paul Gosar and strips him of his two committee assignments. That's the first time a sitting House member has been censured in more than 10 years. It was an action led by House Democrats, and it represents a major rebuke to the Arizona Republican for posting a photoshopped anime video to social media showing him appearing to kill Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also attacking President Joe Biden. He defended it, saying that he voluntarily sort of self-censored and withdrew it. AOC said basically it's crazy. He was specifically speaking to McCarthy, who was defending it. House Minority Leader defending it, and she's going after him basically like, yeah, you shouldn't defend that. And it's crazy to see the Republican leader of a party defending that, which that sounds about right. But at the same time, I don't know. McCarthy's also making this point, and I see this being true. He's saying we're going to do the same thing to you when we get into power, and I completely believe it.
Oh, yeah, of course.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, if they had some depiction of McCarthy getting his head chopped off by AOC, he should do that. They should censor AOC if she did that.
It's not going to be this exact kind of thing. Yeah. It's probably going to be more wokey stuff. And I don't know exactly what that means, but there are all sorts of wokey things that Republicans would potentially decide to get, decide to use. But we'll see. Super vague speculation on my part.
It shouldn't be just kind of, oh, you did this to us, so we're going to find anything to do that to you. That would just, nonsense. Yeah. Even though I could totally see that taking place. But that can't necessarily be justification for you not to hold somebody accountable when they basically have a cartoon or if you're chopping somebody's head or basically killing somebody.
I hear you. So I do hear you. Julius Jones is scheduled to be executed today at 4 p.m. Central Time. That's unless Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt grants him clemency. Jones is sitting in prison for homicide, even as widespread support calls for a reconsideration of the case decided over 20 years ago. Even as the clock is winding down, the Republican governor has still not said whether he will accept a recommendation from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, which voted 3-1 on November 1st earlier this month to commute Jones' sentence to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Jones has received support from the public in the form of a petition with millions of signatures calling for a reconsideration of the case before Jones is executed again later today. This case has also received support from celebrities and public figures, including Kim Kardashian, who have called for him to be granted clemency on this case. Were you following this at all, Jamarl?
Which case?
Julius Jones.
Julius Jones.
No, you were not. So a guy due to be executed 4 p.m. Central Time today in Oklahoma. And I'd heard of it, but I hadn't really looked into it, decided to look into it. It seems like a pretty clear case. First up, he's black. In the state of Oklahoma, people are saying that the jury was clearly has come out racist. So there was like a dude who somebody said that another member of the jury had said they should just take that N-word out behind the jail and kill him. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So somebody on the jury saying that kind of thing clearly should be disqualified. This came out
clearly
years later. But also, his co-defendant, who, by the way, like has since got off, got lighter charges and since got off, has basically since made statements, from what I hear, saying he basically threw Jones under the bus.
Yep.
It wasn't Jones. Jones also has an alibi, apparently, placing him at his parents' home, miles away from the incident the night that the crime occurred. So there are these multiple exculpating factors that were there. People allege that his defense attorneys were incompetent, inexperienced, maybe intentionally, something like that. Anyway, there are all these things about the case that seem like, hey, we should take another look at this. And yet the governor is very slow to do that.
That sounds about right. That often happens where you get, even the Malcolm X thing. Where, they let those two guys off for killing Malcolm X. There were all sorts of issues with that case. As you go into it, you had all sorts of witnesses. You had FBI agents basically at the place that they didn't even bring up in court. Some of those guys had evidence of alibis, meaning we were not here, we were actually somewhere else. Didn't matter. This is kind of the issue with the death penalty, right? Part and parcel to the reason you can't go back 20 years after the death penalty and say, okay, maybe this guy was innocent. And we know we've executed innocent people.
Yep.
Unfortunately, this is not necessarily a bug. This is more so a feature, oftentimes, of these cases where the prosecution doesn't necessarily want to own up to the fact that they basically put somebody on death row that was innocent. Yeah, it's hard.
Speaking about that, let's go to the Malcolm X story real quick. This came out from the New York Times yesterday. Basically, two men. I saw it reported in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about an exclusive there exactly, but two of the men found guilty of the assassination, I'm just quoting directly, of Malcolm X are expected to have their convictions thrown out on Thursday. That's today, of course, according to the Manhattan District Attorney and lawyers for the two men. Also in that article, the idea that the FBI had boots on the ground the day of the assassination, basically.
Yeah, I thought people knew that.
And that there was a reporter. People knew that, but again, coming back to mind, and okay, if we're deciding that the two people that we pin this on or whatever are more or less exonerated,
right?
Who's
guilty?
Who else is guilty? Who else might be in on it? And then those sorts of questions start to come back to mind, especially with all the entrapment stuff we've been talking about over the last couple of months that have been making the rounds.
Yeah,
people are increasingly aware of.
So the guy who wrote I think it was Netflix, Who Killed Malcolm X. Great documentary. He goes into, it was this other member of the Nation of Islam, and he even gives the guy's name. He tracks the guy down in the video and everything else. The New York Times makes mention basically of the same person saying, it looks like this person may be the leading candidate for it. At this point, all these people are dead. And so, these guys have spent, 25 years or something like that in prison? Under this notion that they murdered Malcolm X.
Yeah.
How do you have a life with that?
I don't know. I need to go back and learn more about Malcolm X. I think a lot of my exposure came when I was 10 years old, and my dad showed me the movie Malcolm X, the documentary by Spike Lee. A great documentary, but I was 10. I could not. I need to. And I've seen the interactions. I've seen debates, of course. I've seen his speeches, but I need to learn more about his life and all the circumstances there because it's fascinating. That's just one of those epics of American history, politics. You have the assassinations of JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, in this several decade-long period of like this major change in all these different ways, America's culture, America's geopolitics, all these things happening. Super fascinating. Anyway. Continuing on with national headlines here, provisional data from the CDC shows that over 100,000 people died from drug overdoses between May 2020 and April of 2021 this year, with drug deaths nearly doubling in the past 5 years. Synthetic opiates are still seen as the leading cause of drug overdoses, blamed for nearly 2/3 of the deaths in this latest 12-month period. And by the way, the synthetic opiate problem is only going to grow as Afghanistan shuts down its opium production, basically significantly cutting down on the exportation of heroin, which is one of the main international sources of heroin. That, of course, is the drug that gets people hooked on opiates in a lot of cases, or at least that people go to once they're hooked on opiates in a lot of cases here in the States. It's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, the pharmaceutical industry ties in, but my point is, with heroin not coming in from Afghanistan anymore, what's going to be available on the markets are these synthetics, which are more deadly. They're both stronger acting, but also shorter acting. So people need to use less more often. And if you think about that, you know, the virus, every chance the virus has to pass from one carrier to another, it's a chance for it to mutate. Like if every time you have to take a dose every half an hour, very small dose, every half an hour or whatever, and you get that dose a little bit too high one time because you're really high,
Your potential to off yourself
goes up, and it's this periodic thing. Anyway, but a main part of the problem there, just briefly, of course, is people going off of opiates, then coming back on, and then doing way too much. That's also a big thing that happens with people being, you know, or switching their sources and not knowing what it is. It's all these things that come together that really screw people over and just kill them just like that.
Believe it or not, though, part of that problem has to do.
Yeah, I will focus on this stuff for a second, just because I grew up and I lost a lot of friends to like opiates, and so it's kind of, it was something that I was aware of. And anyway,
See, my response is the opposite. I grew up in situations where pain medication was needed.
Yeah.
And because of the situation that these guys are doing now, it's making it that much more difficult for people who are in pain to get meds. So, you know, yeah, they would go to illegal substances if it's something that can basically deal with the pain. Like if you have, let's say, neuropathy or some other kind of chronic pain condition, and your doctor gets edgy now, was like, oh man, I'm uncomfortable with doing that. What does the person do in that situation? And mind you, I'll give you my own example. I had a doctor going back from when I was 17, maybe 19, ended up with neuropathy just because I was extremely risky with health stuff when I was that age. 17 years old, right? You're going to college and all. And ending up with neuropathy to the point where the nerves in my legs basically disintegrated. And it took maybe about 10 years for it to grow back to get into a point where I can walk on the floor again, like barefoot and everything else. From that point on, I was taking like Tramadol for pain because it was, even though the peripheral nerves came back, the sensory nerves were still screwed up. My doctor had been with me for maybe 20 years, and he had been prescribing the same prescription for like 15 of those years.
Yeah.
And once they started making these changes in regards to the drug thing, well, he's like, oh man, I'm uncomfortable. The federal government is looking at me. They're overwatching me. And at that point, he gets edgy about prescribing pain meds for anything. Like even when my mom would go to him, same thing. He's like, do you honestly believe my mom is abusing drugs? She doesn't even take this stuff until she needs it. And yet he's edgy about it. So basically a doctor who has a certain responsibility to deal with all sorts of medical issues, including issues of pain, no longer does this particular facet of work because he's concerned about this kind of oversight.
Yeah.
And it's not just him. I mean, it runs the gambit. My grandmother ran into it. You have members of the family that ran into it. I eventually went to a pain specialist who basically didn't care because their job is basically pain.
Doing that.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people,
general practitioners, those kinds of things.
yeah, I mean, it just screws with their ability to do
they
the
also
job.
kind of should be, but here's what but I don't want somebody in your situation to be denied access to something that you need. But on the other hand, you hear cases of people prescribing pain meds left and right without actually solving the underlying problem, whatever that may be. And admittedly, with something like you're
Most
dealing
of the time,
with,
there is
you
no way to
can't
solve it. Yeah.
necessarily. It's just a thing that you have to deal with. And so ideally, you'd have a medical system that can discern between those two types of cases and diagnose and, you know, prescribe in one and not in the other. I don't know. What I grew up with was kids growing out of broken homes, and one of those kids particularly, his mom was on pain meds. She was on a lot of pain meds, and she was a screwed up enough parent that she would give some of those pain meds to him, and all of a sudden he started sharing them with his friends, and he started to look for the harder stuff, and there's this cascading effect in communities, and so that's not good. I don't want that. I don't want her getting them and giving them out to all my friends.
Yeah. It is problematic.
Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, again, it would require discernment, and I don't know how you build discernment into bureaucracies. That's a classically difficult thing to do.
I mean, that doesn't sound like discernment into bureaucracy. That sounds like discernment for the parent giving their kids drugs.
Well, yeah, sure, on that level too, 100%. Totally. Let's keep on going. Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman, was sentenced to 41 months in prison for his role in the U.S. Capitol riot. The Justice Department had asked for Chansley to receive a harsh sentence as a way to set an example among the January 6th rioters. The QAnon shaman, the crazy dude in like the wolf or buffalo head,
with no shirt on or something,
regalia, whatever, no shirt with like blue paint.
That's why he got all the time. He was too iconic.
It was too iconic. They're like, you got to slap this dude down. Exactly. In international news, sex offenders convicted of multiple rapes could face chemical castration in Pakistan after lawmakers on Wednesday passed new anti-rape legislation that aims to speed up convictions and impose tougher sentences. It comes in response to a mass public outcry over a recent surge in rapes against women and children in the country and growing demands to ensure justice for victims of sexual assault. I don't know how I feel about that one, but I might not feel horrible about chemical castration for repeat rapists. I don't know, man. That's an interesting one. Something to come back to.
I don't feel horrible about it.
Yeah.
I mean, keep your pants, keep it to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, something to come back to potentially. China's test of a hypersonic missile over the summer, quote, went around the world, end quote. That's according to the second most senior U.S. general. Speaking in an interview released on Tuesday, it sheds new details on the test, warning that China might one day be able to launch a surprise nuclear attack on the United States. Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, but we could do that to them too, and I don't know, man. The Philippines condemned in strongest terms, quote unquote, the actions of 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels which blocked and used water cannons on 2 Manila supply boats on their way to a Philippine-occupied atoll in the South China Sea. That's according to the Philippines' top diplomat on Thursday, speaking today. Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin said no one was hurt during the November 16th incident at the Second Thomas Shoal, but that the Philippine boats, which were transporting food supplies to military personnel based there, had to abort their mission. And in holiday news, today is Apple Cider Day, Great American Smokeout Day, Married to a Scorpio Support Day, Mickey Mouse Day, and Mickey and Minnie Mouse's birthdays, and that's just all advertising for Disney. I didn't want to do it. I'm just saying that's Disney setting that up to get people paying attention to their characters. Anyway, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we went long on those headlines because we got into talking about a couple of them. I'm going to take us straight into our break so we can come back in Jamarl's Soapbox, his monologue segment. You're listening to Fault Lines, and we'll be right back.
Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys just so happen to be in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I'm going to call it audible. Initially, I wanted to do a commentary on the Gosher and AOC, basically the censure Gosher turning around and basically using a video of him beheading AOC and turning to Joe Biden, and how inappropriate that is. But we can talk about that later in the headlines. There's something else I want to get to that I think is that much more important, and I think is illustrative of something that the African-American community in the United States need to pay attention to. It is a big deal. It is quite awesome, and it is something that I'm going to give the Ethiopian and Eritrean community credit for. Props for. Eritrean, thank you.
Sorry.
Props for. It's a big deal. So, in the election with Joe Biden, in the election with Terry McAuliffe versus Glenn Youngkin, you had a situation where the Democrat basically lost. Now, the Democrat didn't just lose, it was a painful, stinging loss in a state that is somewhat of a purple state and is trending more towards a blue state. You even had the situation in New Jersey where the Democrat there had a difficulty winning that race. But I want to focus on Virginia for a bit. How did Terry McAuliffe lose that race? Now, when you're looking at the numbers specifically, Glenn Youngkin, 50.6%, votes 1,663,596. Terry McAuliffe, 48.7%, 1,600,116 votes. That's a 600,000, give or take, vote difference, 660,000 vote difference between the two. 60,000 vote difference between the two numbers. It's a close race, right? By the same token, it's 60,000 votes. That's not necessarily anything to wink at. Now, if you remember, the Biden administration and the media in the United States has taken a certain tact, I would call it line, about what is taking place in Ethiopia right now. You had the TPLF that basically opened up an attack on Abiy Ahmed's government in Ethiopia. And instead of the media reporting it that way, and instead of the media in this country being honest, saying, yeah, they did attack the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government is defending themselves against this case. And even though there might be certain excesses on either side of this, at the end of the day, all of this started and began with the TPLF, who didn't necessarily want to give up control and power of the country that they basically ran with an iron fist for 27 years. Biden comes out with this policy basically saying he is passing sanctions and he is limiting or cutting trade with Ethiopia as a result of a conflict that the other group started. Meaning you have a democratic elected government that was basically attacked by an authoritarian government that was there previously. And the response of the United States, because of the previous allegiances and the previous ties with the TPLF and that particular government, wasn't to, hey, you guys need to stop attacking the democratically elected government. No, their response was to try to get Ethiopia to basically fall back, for them to not engage, for them as if they are the ones that are doing something wrong in this particular contest. Again, war often has excesses, but that's not what we're talking about here. The media in the United States and the government of the United States took a very specific tact against Ethiopia, almost having them to, on some level, demobilize or to be concerned that the U.S. and Western powers were going to do something in order to adversely affect the Ethiopian government on behalf of the TPLF, the authoritarian group that basically robbed from that country for decades. So what did Ethiopians do? Whereas African-American voters often have a tendency to vote Democrat, regardless of what Democrats do, and even without getting anything in return for those particular votes, nothing short of just keeping the Republican out, 90% of blacks tend to vote Democrat. Again, regardless of what the Democratic Party does, regardless of the malfeasance, regardless of them not putting in policy that best affect their particular demographic. If you get that many people voting for a particular party, you would think that that particular group would have certain sway and leverage. But the problem is there is no sway and leverage from African Americans because they don't necessarily use it in a way that is punitive. Meaning, if you give your vote over automatically, doesn't matter what the other person do, doesn't matter if they support your interests, doesn't matter if they vote in policy that is in your best interest or suited to you, then they accept your vote as just a gimme. They don't have to appease you. They don't have to reach out for your vote. They give you these verbal platitudes, and that in and of itself holds sway in lieu of getting anything real done or accomplished. What did the Ethiopians do in this situation? They went out and voted for Youngkin. Now, the catch here is Youngkin, after the United States basically went with sanctions and cutting and limiting trade and everything else and basically taking the side of the TPLF in this particular conflict, or at the very least, taking a skeptical eye towards Ethiopia, making the government's lot in this particular conflict that much more fraught. Well, they got angry, and they exerted that anger at the ballot box. Maryland and Virginia and D.C. have some of the highest concentrations of Ethiopians and Eritreans in this country, bar none. Those Ethiopians and Eritreans, after Biden's stance on this, after the U.S. decided to basically go after the Ethiopian government for it defending itself against a previous authoritarian iron-fisted government, what they did was went out and voted for Youngkin, especially after Youngkin came out and asked for their vote. Youngkin basically made the point that I want you guys to come out and vote for me, the immigrant community, and not just vote for me, I am going to put through policy that is going to expand the trade relationship with Ethiopia. So you have Democrats, who Ethiopians typically went to like 79% or more for Democrats, switch their vote to Youngkin as punishment for Biden's, let's say, policy towards that country and the malfeasance of this administration, and honestly, the dishonesty and the way this media and administration has basically functioned within regards to Ethiopia. They went out and punished the administration. Now, how many Ethiopians are there in Virginia? Well, estimates go from, let's say, 100,000 to maybe 200,000. The number is not necessarily entirely clear, but let's go with the low number for the moment. Let's say 100,000. Now, from some of the estimates, let's say the majority, overwhelmingly so, like 70 to 80% vote Democrat. 69 to 70% of that group switched to Republican to vote for Youngkin. It may even be higher than that. But definitely, that's basically the average in regards to the switch from one side to the other. Again, very specific, very straightforward. You are going after our interests. We're going to go after your interests. I'm going to make the point that it was Ethiopians that handed this election to Youngkin, and good on them for doing so. What the point that I'm trying to make here is that African Americans need to take a page out of this playbook. You shouldn't give your vote over as if it's a perfunctory thing. Votes are transitional. The notion is you're giving that vote over because you're getting something in return for that particular vote. And if you are one of the parties that are basically accepted as 90% of the vote, and you're not getting anything for that, you're getting had. You're getting had. Why do you think Joe Biden made that statement, if you don't vote for me, you're not black? It's because they've gotten so accustomed to getting the black vote for nothing in return for it, that they just accept it as if you're owed or they're owed your particular vote. It's nonsense. It's as much nonsense as it is that Ethiopians owe their vote to Democrats. They do not. And they were willing to get that across in the ballot box in one of the most damning ways to try to make their anger felt. And it was felt. Biden, or you can say Terry McAuliffe, as a stand-in in this case for Joe Biden, loses that race. Again, McAuliffe loses by 60,000 votes. And how many Ethiopians and Eritreans do you have in Virginia? What, up to 100,000, maybe a little bit more? That is well over the amount necessary to give that race to Youngkin. African Americans, be aware of this. This is illustrative. This is the teaching moment. And in this teaching moment, what you need to get across is either they support your interests or they don't get your vote, period. So this goes to the Ethiopian thing. I was looking this up yesterday, and I was trying to figure out, okay, how many people or what was the exact number of the election tally? Well, that number is 1,663,596. All right, how many did McAuliffe get? 1,600,116. Basically, a 60,000 vote margin between the two.
Totally. Ethiopians swung it.
Yes, exactly.
Basically, there's a strong argument to be made.
Completely swung it.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you're thinking that there's 100,000 Ethiopians, there may be a little bit more, a little bit less. And those Ethiopians got angry at Biden and the administration's policy towards Ethiopia, and their thought is, fine. And I can read through the quotes. Totally. And some of the people that I know have said the exact same thing. I can't believe the Biden administration is doing this. I can't believe Democrats are acting this way, et cetera, et cetera. And their thought was, we'll show you we're going to punish you for this. And lo and behold, they gave it to Youngkin. Youngkin is the one who came out basically saying, I'm going to extend trade. Biden wanted to attack him. Punishment.
It's one of those interesting stories that we hear about.
Yeah.
And
Lauded.
we were talking about, I think that this network particularly has done a very good job of covering the story, basically compared to any other outlet operating out of D.C. or in the West or whatever. I'll put it like this. Last week, there was that protest out in front of the White House, the Ethiopian protest. We brought it up on air. I believe that was early last week.
Yeah. Yeah, because Bob got back last week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We went down to it. Bob went down to cover it. Jack and I went down. We saw it. And nobody was there. That's the point that I'm getting to. They're complaining about fake news. They're complaining of CNN, BBC. They're complaining about these outlets lying about it. Bob Schlehuber, host of Political Misfits, he went to Ethiopia and became a superstar basically because he wasn't lying. And they saw it. And they celebrated him for it. But everybody else is lying, and there's no news coverage down at this protest. This is one of those stories that it's like, okay, a lifting of the veil for a second. This is happening. The news media isn't covering it, and it swung. You can, as with any election, you can make, okay, this demography, that demography, this swung it in that way. But seriously, it's enough people. You can strongly make the case that for reasons that weren't talked about, weren't diagnosed nationally, the Democrats, the DNC won't learn from. This is one of those things where it's like, hey guys, you're missing the lesson. These people got on the other train, and you paid no attention to them. You paid no attention to them. You didn't care about them. Basically, you were fixated on the same things you've been fixated on for years now. I wanted to pair this briefly with a headline. I was on the Critical Hour with Garland and Wilmer yesterday. He asked me to come on. We were talking about this article from the New York Times from the day before. Title of the article: U.S. allies drive much of world's democratic decline, data shows. Think about that for a second. New York Times article talking about how how U.S.'s allies are driving the decline in democracy. Yeah. Now they brought me on to talk about it, and I was thinking about it, of course, before I went on, and what went through my mind was, and it comes back to mind now. What this article goes into is basically for a decade-long period in the 2010s, before Trump, before Bolsonaro, before Russiagate, before Brexit, there had been a bunch of Western-aligned countries, ones you might not think of, like Slovenia or Finland, for instance, who had seen declines in their levels of democracy. You know, these are sort of things like access to voting, whether the courts are politicized, those kinds of things.
I would imagine.
Media, those kinds of things. Media access, media freedom, corporate consolidation, those kinds of things, broadly. And with some of that stuff, I'd need to look into it because maybe the ones that I know that they were looking at politicization of the courts, I inserted those. Media probably comes to mind, but I'm just not 100% sure. So I want to put a asterisk next to that. But broadly, here's my point. This happened, this decline, which is clear and which was in mostly Western aligned countries, precedes all this stuff with Russiagate and Brexit. And what came to mind is Russiagate as an extension, not an extension, it's a way to cover for our failures. Russiagate wasn't just about Trump. It was first and foremost about Russia. It's literally named after the country. It's saying this outside country is weakening our democracy. They're intervening in our affairs. They're getting us polarized against each other. They're, through their messaging and agitprop or whatever, they're destroying our democracy. The Washington Post literally changed its tagline for the newspaper to "Democracy dies in darkness," talking about Trump and Russia. And all the while, before any of this was going on, we were weakening from within. And my sense is that the Western elites, to explain this or to avoid having to explain it to themselves, the sense that there's this internal rot based on the United States, focused on the United States. The article goes into that, how all these other Western-aligned democracies are really just sort of trying to stay close to the U.S. as this major military power. Well, and they look to us, and as they see our political system decaying and getting more corrupt, all these problems, they no longer need to stick with us. They get a little bit more authoritarian. They go over in whichever directions they want to go. My point is, Russiagate, I will argue very clearly, and it's representative of the establishment, has been used by the elites as a tool to not focus on the internal contraction and problem they're dealing with, all the internal corruption, and all these things that we talk about pretty regularly in our political system. They're basically saying, no, it's the Russians. No, it's this outside force, and now it's becoming the Chinese. But with coming back to Ethiopia, and this is why it comes to mind, no, it's not. It's our decisions, our foreign policy decisions, our leaders not paying attention to their constituents. These Ethiopians are their constituents. They're just not listening to them. They're focusing on whatever fantasy they've concocted, whatever convenient narrative they've concocted to make the problem somebody else's. You see where I'm going with that? Yeah. And that's sort of where my mind went based on you focusing on the Ethiopia thing. Admittedly, a bit of a tangent, but.
And by the way, just so we're clear, with the number of Ethiopians that are in the country, if they would have voted for Terry McAuliffe, he would have won the race. That's the point that I'm getting at. That it was just enough of them to basically change their vote to directly in his campaign, full stop. Whereas if Biden hadn't taken this tact, or if the U.S. and the media and everything hadn't taken this kind of farcical argument or farcical conclusions in the way that they're going after the TPLF, helping the TPLF while undermining the Ethiopian government, well, they would have just voted the way they typically vote, 79% or more Democrat, which would have put McAuliffe over the finish line.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Love it. Look, man, African Americans, take note. You've been instructed. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, a lot of things. Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, also recovering libertarian. But usually, Mark, the first couple words get the idea across of what we're planning on talking with you about. Economist and professor, economics professor in some sense. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing quite well. How about you guys?
Good to hear. Completely random, and I'll keep it brief. Did you ever by any chance watch the show Twin Peaks?
I did.
You know the connection, right?
Not watch the sequel, though. I haven't seen that, but I did watch it. I did watch Twin Peaks when it came out.
When it came out on ABC back in 1990. And do you know the stupid punny joke for why I'm bringing this up?
I don't.
I'm sorry, then. It's David Lynch and Mark Frost are the co-creators of Twin Peaks. And
I get it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's that stupid thing. It's just, anyway.
It's me. I get all of his mail.
I bet. That's the thing. I remember we were first bringing you on as a guest, and I was trying to find out about you, and I was like, damn, I can't find info on this guy. I'm sure it's a shame in its own way, but it's a good TV show. And so hopefully not something you mind being associated with in some way. Anyway, let's get into it. We're talking about Jen Psaki lying about inflation. Jen Psaki, of course, White House press secretary. Now, we focused on this briefly yesterday, Mark. We, in fact, played this. Actually, I don't think we did play this clip. No, yes, we did. We'll play it again. This is Jen Psaki, and we'll set it up like this. Play it in full. Folks can judge for themselves. But particularly the part that I know I know your position on, Mark. Listen to Jen Psaki's just first answer here. The question that gets asked of her. Listen to what she has to say about it right up front, and think for yourself. Does that actually make sense? Andre, let's play this clip.
Broadly on the state of America right now, inflation obviously at a 31-year high right now. Americans are seeing their dollars, their paychecks stretched right now. Why should Americans not be concerned that injecting another $1.75 trillion or more would further raise inflation?
Because no economist out there is projecting that this will have a negative impact on inflation. And actually, what it will help do is will help increase economic productivity. It will help economic growth in this country. That and the Build Back Better agenda will help reduce inflation, will help cut costs for the American people over the long term.
But as you acknowledge, that's over the long term. So I guess for those Americans who are really struggling with the bottom line right now, what is the president doing now, like immediately, to try to directly impact the rising costs that Americans are witnessing?
Well, the number one thing that the president can do is help get COVID under control. That we know is the root cause of inflation and the price increases we're seeing for a range of reasons. That is the best step that he can take, that the administration can take to help get it under control. I'd also note, though, in many of his proposals, but his Build Back Better agenda that is currently working its way through Congress, and we're eager for the House to pass this week, there are a number of components in there that will lower costs next year for the American people, cutting child care costs in half, making preschool free for families starting in 2022, saving families $8,600, leading to the construction of additional housing units. We're seeing housing and the cost of rent as a major driver of costs for families across the country. And even on issues like negotiating prescription drugs, there are people across the country that are paying a lot of money out of pocket for insulin. It will cap the cost at $35. The president has a plan for lowering costs for the American people. No one is denying that inflation and any element of raising costs is an issue for the American people. The question is,
I'm going to cut in right here.
We're proposing solutions.
No one is denying that raising costs and inflation is a problem for the American people. And again, I will go back to what she first said, which is paraphrasing slightly. I was trying to take the note. No economists right now are predicting. No economists out there right now are predicting dangerous inflation, higher dangerous inflation, something like that. Mark, what are your thoughts?
I don't know whether to cry or laugh or just be enraged, because when I heard that, when she said that and I heard no economist, my ears like a dog's or something just perked up. And then I listened to the rest of what she said, and I'm like, how can one person be so wrong in so many aspects of one subject in one statement? It was bizarre. It's like they have their head in the sand. With the same passion, it's what you folks were just talking about on Russiagate. It's so wrong that you wonder, these people can't be stupid. Do they have some nefarious agenda? And I don't know what I fear more, that they have some sort of strange agenda that they're not just being clean with, or they're incompetent. Because no economist, first of all, is just ridiculous. I polled everyone I know well, and even casually. Even economists that tend to lean to the left understand that when you print debt, it's going to be inflationary. What economists disagree on is whether that's a good thing or not. And certainly the orthodox view is that if you print a bunch of debt, you're going to get inflation. It's literally a causal situation. So if you print money and then you print treasury bills, essentially very similar things, they're debt instruments. You flood the economy with incredible liquidity, and what you get is a dollar which has less purchasing power than it had before. That's essentially inflation. And they've danced around it, they've played around it, and what I find most insulting, and again, that's what bothered me about Russiagate. I wasn't an expert on any of that stuff, but it didn't sound right. It just sounded stupid. And I'm like, okay, I don't have the expertise to go in and say, okay, this is true or not true, but it doesn't feel right. Well, in this subject, I do have the expertise to say whether it's true or not. Yeah. It's not true.
Mark, what specifically about her statement that you find to be the most deplorable? I mean, look, anytime you're going to make a statement that says there's no economists, we have economists who are on the left, we have economists on the right. You have somebody like Richard Wolff, you have somebody who's, on a far right in regards to this stuff. So saying no economists is treacherous in and of itself. But what is the specific aspects? You said there were multiple lies in that particular statement. What were the multiple lies and what was the most egregious?
Well, at first, it was just the no economist that got me. And then I cut her a little bit of slack. I go, okay, sometimes people use the word always or no or never, and they use it, in a more perfunctory,
thoughtless way. Mm-hmm. They just sort of say it.
Yeah. And then she kept talking about, she goes, well, inflation is caused by COVID-19. And I remember being on your guys' show. This was probably, oh my goodness, this is pushing 2 years ago, 18 months ago, 20 months ago. And I was warning about excessive spending even back then. I think I said something like, we're probably going to reach a time within the next year or so where people are much less worried about COVID-19.
Yeah, I remember this.
of the day is going to be our reaction to COVID-19.
Yep.
And, I mean, the money we've spent, we could have done some wonderful things for some very low-income people that would have changed some lives and would have protected from COVID-19. And this goes back to Trump administration too. I'm not really a partisan guy. I like to look at the issues and just call them as I see them. What she seems to get wrong is that she doesn't seem to understand basic supply and demand of money at all. They seem to want to blend. They almost seem like they're myopic in the sense that all they can see is one issue. And we absolutely need to be aware of, we need to be diligent on pandemics. But it's not the only issue. It's just like in your life. You know, most people don't want to get sick, but they also don't want to lose their home. They also want to eat. They have multiple worries in their life, and it's not just one. But this administration reminds me of one of those dolls that they had when I was a kid. You would pull a string on them, and they would say something. They had about 3 things that they would say, and you pull the string, and they say it. And that's what they remind me of. And, 5 years ago, it was Russiagate. Pull the string, Russiagate. Russians are coming. When I was a kid, the Japanese were coming. Now it's the Chinese that are coming. When I was a young adult, it was, drugs were going to destroy the country. Needed a war on drugs. There's a paranoia that I think it comes from the media. I think it sells clicks, sells newspapers, sells magazines, and there's a paranoia that gets people going that has to have an impact. Even in the little cat volunteering I do, where I meet the retail public, a lot, I see people coming in with 1-year-old kids with masks and things like that. And, we get a discussion going on and, I give them a few references and say, well, here's some articles you might want to go look at. And by the way, that particular cute little T-shirt mask isn't doing anything. But they're so scared that the media really can get people frightened. And when people become frightened, they probably aren't as rational as they otherwise would be.
I think that might be the point, though. And I will come back to your, is this nefarious or is this just, it's Hanlon's razor, the one that I always go back to, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. So usually I just assume that people don't know what they're doing instead of that they have it out for me. But at a certain point, I feel like there needs to be an addendum to that rule, which is like when you have enough malice and you have enough stupidity, or if you have enough of one, you've got to assume at some point that you can't distinguish them, and you might have both. In other words, if we see people making these consistently bad decisions, if you see them in power making these consistently bad decisions, at a certain point, it doesn't matter. You might want to know to, just understand what they're going to do, like predict their motivations, but you can treat them as if they're both incompetent and maleficent or whatever, as if they're both bad people and incompetent. Because in the case of Jen Psaki, I'll turn to the specifics. It's like she's plugging her ears in some sense, and she wants everybody else to do it at the same time. They probably are listening to inside economists who are saying that the level of spending and the specific social programs they're trying to get through with the Build Back Better plan are not going to produce, hardcore inflation. But those are just some economists. And I know that there are a lot of economists who would disagree with that. There should be an active conversation. But in order to get their political agenda through, I would argue they just want to shut that conversation up the same way they handled the COVID crisis, where they just want to shut down dissenting opinions, whatever those may be, valid or not valid. And with Jen Psaki, and without getting into the details of the COVID fear-mongering business, because we'll probably disagree on some parts of that, probably agree on some others, but it's just sort of irrelevant. With inflation, I want to come back to that sort of high-level appraisal thing right now. Inflation hurts, as you've said, the poorest among us, the first and the hardest, basically. But we're in a weird situation right now because last year, earlier this one, a lot of people got infusions of cash. Now, it seems like those benefited in a lot of ways, what we might call the middle class, even though it's shrinking. There are a lot of people who say, they had a good job. We've talked about this with you. Might have had a decent job, but they suddenly got money in their savings account from these stimulus checks. The nature of the world is shifting with lockdowns and the virus at play. Suddenly they decide to work from home, maybe start homeschooling their kid, whatever the case may be. They seem like they're doing okay right now. But poor people, by and large, as far as I can tell, are still at about the same risk of eviction. The money that, you'd think, okay, you got all this money now, often it's just getting spent on whatever day-to-day goods or month-to-month things. It's not getting put into capital. Now, that's stage one. The second stage, as far as I can tell, Mark, is if you get serious inflation and the stock market starts to take hits, then it's not just poor people. Then the middle class starts to take hits too, because their 401ks, their IRAs, their retirement accounts, their real net worth, just potentially, if you get a serious stock market crisis, that gets wiped out. Now, where you'd come in, I'm trying to think of Schumpeter. I could see the government implementing programs to help poor people, but by and large, just looking at those two stages, the only people who don't seem to be seriously hurt are the rich. It seems like in the first stage, the poorest among us, the working class broadly, it doesn't do well at all, but working class and below that, whatever. And then the second stage, middle class potentially gets wiped out. Is that a sort of potentially predictable chain of events that we're going to have a major stock market crash, some next economic recession that seriously hits the middle class, contributing to an already ailing working class? In other words, I'm trying to paint a picture of how this is going to roll out, Mark, through an economic lens to get the truth out, because Jen Psaki apparently doesn't want us to hear it. Mark, what do you see happening here?
Well, the first thing that I see happening is a massive transfer of wealth. It's no secret how the ultra wealthy finance their lives. Let's say that you had $10 billion in the bank. You don't live off your $10 billion. You borrow. You have a trust fund. You have some very brilliant lawyers and accountants, and the goal is to die in debt. That's something people rarely understand, that you borrow the money because when you borrow money, you don't pay income taxes on borrowed money. Now, if you have strong inflation, who does that really benefit? Because in any economic process, somebody benefits. There's always going to be somebody that benefits when things are dynamic and they change. So,
strong inflation, it benefits the borrowers, right?
Well, yes, it benefits people who are massively in debt because they get to pay back their loans with discounted dollars on fixed amounts. So it's big trust accounts, things like that. Now, little people can have debts too, but the problem there is they have a benefit and a large cost because they have to manage that debt service. It wasn't that long ago, just 12 years ago, that we had a mortgage crisis in this country, primarily because we had variable rate mortgages, which have come back now, and then the market crashed because there was too many derivative instruments around those adjustable rates. And then when rates went up, people couldn't afford their mortgages anymore, and then they started to default on their loans, and then we had a crisis. It's almost like in this country, we go from crisis to crisis to crisis, and we never learn our lessons from the previous crisis.
But isn't that, just pausing on that for a second, isn't that the classic Marxist critique of capitalism, that it's set up for these boom-bust cycles? I'm not a Marxist, but I know that critique. What's your, just briefly on that, Mark?
Sure. Except I'm kind of leaning a little bit more on the nefarious side here. I mean, if you read Das Kapital, if you read Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, I believe it's section 2, the first chapter is section 2, Schumpeter just states, he goes, the first thing a socialist would want to do as they embark upon their plan would be to bring about large-scale inflation. Because large-scale inflation, over time and in a silent manner, sort of eliminates the middle class. Maybe not eliminate's too strong a word. It puts incredible financial pressure on the bourgeoisie. It taxes the bourgeoisie is what it does.
But wait, just so I'm clear, who are you saying was responsible wait, you're saying that you believe somebody was doing this on purpose. Who do you believe is doing this on purpose?
Well, there's only one. Well, the buck stops with really one institution, and that's the Federal Reserve.
So you think the Federal Reserve is intentionally creating inflation? You think they're Marxists or socialists?
Well, I think they absolutely. Well, for instance, when the Federal Reserve wants to stimulate employment, they're purposely
creating inflation.
Yeah. And you can't have it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So if you want to have full employment, then you're going to have to deal with some inflation.
Well, a job of the Federal Reserve, literally the whole creation of money business, in some sense, you can see it. That's creating inflation. One way of viewing it mathematically, it's like you reframe things. It is an inflation-creating machine. I'm not trying to be. That's like, if you took that the wrong way, it would just be me insulting the Federal Reserve. But technically, it's designed to create money. The more money you have in supply, the more inflation you get. Unless, of course, you get a concomitant rise in GDP to match that, right?
Well, yes. I mean, and ironically, people are schizophrenic on this issue. So, for instance, I'm actually very pro-immigration. I think the salvation of this country will be a massive influx of taxable, productive, new people who breed. That's who we want. We want people who will come to this country, work, pay taxes, and have lots and lots of kids. That's what we want. I see no other way out of the hole we've dug ourselves in than that, and that sort of gets the Republicans mad at me. But, you know, if we stop printing money and we have more people and more productivity, we can dig ourselves out of this. We haven't gone so far that we're Zimbabwe. I mean, we're not there. But we are right up to that thin ice, and we need to be careful because you know, I don't know whether it's intentional, kind of like that quote you just talked about. I don't know if it's intentional. It might just be they're so myopic that they can't see anything other than I'm going to have a legacy of stopping COVID-19. But you can't save your hand and shoot your heart.
Mark, when would you say this inflation basically took off? Would you say this was a year, 2 years, or was it something that was taking place over the last 20 years?
No, I've been talking about inflation, I believe, since you guys have had me on. So I was very worried about inflation when Trump was president.
Yeah, I remember talking with you about it. But Jamarl, you're thinking of the mansion thing, or where were you going?
No, I mean, I guess my thing is the Federal Reserve had been putting money into the economy ever since the 2008 crash.
A lot longer than that, but yeah,
but you know what I mean. The quantitative easing, right?
Totally. Yeah.
But it didn't necessarily seem to create any kind of inflationary pressures in regards to the economy. The inflation thing seemed to have started over the course of the last several years with the COVID and all the money they were putting into the economy and everything during that point. I guess my thing is, it didn't seem like the Federal Reserve was this kind of inflation-making machine. In fact, it seemed like it was the opposite, that they were basically, whatever they were doing, they were trying to keep inflation down in order to keep the value of the dollars or money high.
Isn't the last time we had real inflation like 70s stagflation?
Yeah.
Which isn't just inflation, it's stagflation, but...
Yeah, but that's kind of my point. It didn't come across as if, for the longest time that the Federal Reserve has been in action, that they've just been increasing or creating inflation. This seems to be something that was recent. Well, tell me if I'm wrong, Mark. I could be wrong.
I think that's a testament to how silently they work. I mean, if you go back to November of 1913 at their inception, you have a 30-fold increase of the price level, because that's why you have a central bank. That's why you have an active central bank, so you can manage the money supply and you can tinker with the price of money. Because if you can't do that, you can't engage in deficit spending. There is a strong relationship between the money supply and a nation's ability to engage in deficit spending.
Should they increase the interest rates then?
In the country, for instance, the price of gold was $20.50 forever, and then 1913 came along, and all of a sudden it started floating. Then everybody started wanting to redeem their gold. Then they stopped the redeemability of gold. During the Roosevelt administration, it was even illegal, other than certain exceptions for jewelry and things like that. And then Nixon, pulled nailed the final nail into the coffin. August 1st, 1972, when he took us off the international gold standard, and that let the dollar float.
Nixon shock.
Yeah. Mark, real quick, before we go, we have about 30 seconds. Should they increase interest rates in order to deal with inflation at this point?
It doesn't matter whether we should or shouldn't. One thing I guarantee you, and you can quote me on this, the Fed will be raising interest rates because it's the only way you can fight inflation. So it's the opposite of quantitative easing. Instead of buying bonds from banks, they're going to sell bonds at a discount to banks and they're going to purposely force a illiquid situation in the monetary system so that mortgages and borrowing and things like that will be harder. And if you go back to the 70s...
Mark, we can't, we're out of time, basically. Real briefly, I'm taking notes. I got your quote down. We got to follow back up because you keep making these predictions, and a lot of them keep coming true. Thank you for joining us. Everybody listening, that was Mark Frost, economist, professor, Schumpeterian, recovering libertarian, and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show. That was good.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean, more likely than not, that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on. Good conversation with Mark Frost. I always enjoy those, even though the guy's a right-winger. Yeah. I enjoy those. Oftentimes, we don't necessarily get the opportunity to... Well, we talk to both economists. We have Richard Wolff on one side.
You say he's a right-winger, but he's like a weird right-winger. If you take that second, I get what you mean, but he's also the one who's like, we should be dropping cash from helicopters to poor people.
Crackhead Louie or whatever he was calling.
Crackhead Bob.
Yeah, Crackhead Bob.
Yeah,
right.
I got to remember, he says this stuff that throws you off kilter.
Well, the thing is, he has a tendency to look at this stuff in what I would call somewhat of an earnest way, even if I disagree with him, and that makes sense.
Philosophical, reasonable, even if you disagree with the logic, there's always a logic to it.
Yeah, it's not, it's not this ironclad ideological position, even though it is an ideological position. There's a sense of honesty associated with it. Like, yeah, man, in this situation, you need to print dollars. Despite how I feel about this is what you need to do. I accept that, right? And so it makes it easier to talk to, even when you disagree with him. So good on Mark for coming on, having a conversation about it. Let's get into the headlines. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 114,361 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,603 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 88,140 cases per day, an increase of 23% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 69% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,390,239 people across the United States and has killed a greatly unfortunate 766,206 men, women, and children in this country. Every time I say unfortunate, I always catch myself like, how do I know if that's unfortunate? Nevertheless, it's unfortunate for us. These people are gone. In national news, the House of Representatives voted Wednesday to approve a resolution that censures Representative Paul Gosar and strips him of 2 committee assignments, the first time a sitting House member has been censured in more than 10 years. The action, led by Democrats, represents a major rebuke of the Arizona Republican for posting Photoshopped anime video to social media showing him appearing to kill showing him killing Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and then turning to attack Joe Biden. We have clips of this. Engineer, please pull up clips for a moment. Let's go with Paul first and then AOC, and I give a moment to do it. Immediately after he was censured, he goes out and puts the tweet back up, meaning he gets angry and goes out and puts the exact same clip back up that he was censured for, despite the fact that he was like, I took it down because there were some members who were bothered by it. I self-censored, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he unself-censored immediately after this closure vote.
But did he did that, my guess is so that people would see it for themselves, right?
No, I think he was pissed off. Yeah, I think he was annoyed. I think he was angry.
He'd probably say the second thing. I don't know. I'm guessing stuff here.
But let's play the clip.
Yeah.
This is Gosar.
Address and reject the mischaracterization, accusations from many in this body that the cartoon from my office is dangerous or threatening. It was not, and I reject the false narrative categorically. I do not espouse violence towards anyone. I never have. It was not my purpose to make anyone upset. I voluntarily took the cartoon down, not because it was itself a threat, but because some thought it was. Out of compassion for those who generally felt offense, I self-censored. Last week, my staff posted a video depicting a policy battle regarding amnesty for tens of millions of illegal aliens. This is an enemy that speaks to young voters who are too often overlooked. Even Twitter, the left's mouthpiece, did not remove the cartoon, noting it was in the public's interest for it to remain. The cartoon directly contributes to the understanding and the discussion of the real-life battle resulting from this administration's open border policies. This body is considering passage of Mr. Biden's reckless, socialist, Marxist $4.9 trillion spending bill that provides $100 billion for amnesty to tens of millions of illegal aliens already in this country. This is what the left doesn't want the American people to know. Our country is suffering from the plague of illegal immigration. I don't stop pointing this out, nor will I. Millions of illegal aliens, drugs, and human traffickers are being led in and moved around our country in the dead of night, all condoned by this administration.
Such a compassionate guy. And basically, Attack on Titan. Have you ever seen that anime?
No.
Attack on Titan is phenomenal anime. My wife turned me on to it.
Remember you talking about it?
Yeah, but basically he did something with the Attack on Titan anime, but basically had him murdering AOC. He's like, no, there was nothing intended by this. I don't espouse violence. It was a violent cartoon. It's like, I don't know why he doesn't think that's over the line in regards to how they engage with one another. You got to work with these people. It's like, how are you putting a cartoon out there with you basically killing one of your opponents? It just looks horrendous. Let's hear AOC for the moment. This is AOC's response to this. Okay. Well, let's do.
I've been serving in this body just under 3 years. Not 3 years, enormous amount has happened. But in response to the Republican leader's remarks when he says that this action is unprecedented, what I believe is unprecedented is for a member of House leadership of either party to be unable to condemn incitement of violence against a member of this body. It is sad. It is a sad day in which a member who leads a political party in the United States of America cannot bring themselves to say that issuing a depiction of murdering a member of Congress is wrong, and instead decides to venture off into a tangent about gas prices and inflation. What is so hard? What is so hard about saying that this is wrong?
Okay. I hate it when politicians do that. What is so wrong? I hate that. Be stronger on that front. By the same token, she has a point. She's talking about McCarthy here, right? Because didn't you say McCarthy basically was giving excuses for Gozar on this and went into this kind of other?
We didn't play the McCarthy clip. Yeah. We just played the Gozar clip where he is not he's talking about immigration there. Yeah, that's not what she's referring to.
No.
But yeah, no, she was responding because she and McCarthy were going back and forth.
That's what it is. Okay,
but in that clip, I'm not sure.
Very interesting. Well, she's a leader of a party. That's why.
Pardon me. I skipped that.
But let's keep going. Julius Jones is scheduled to be executed today at 4 p.m. Central Time, unless Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt grants his clemency. Jones is sitting in prison for homicide, even as widespread support calls for reconsideration of the case. Even as the clock is winding down, the Republican governor has still not said whether he would accept the recommendation from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, which voted 3-1 on November 1st to commute Jones' sentence to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Jones has received support from the public in the form of a petition with millions of signatures calling for a reconsideration of the case before Jones is executed, along with support from celebrities and public figures, including Kim Kardashian. Provisional data from the CDC shows that over 100,000 people died from drug overdoses between May 2020 and April 2021, with drug deaths nearly doubling in the past 5 years. Synthetic opiates are still seen as the leading cause of drug overdoses, blamed for nearly 2/3 of the deaths in the last 12-month period. You know, COVID is probably a big thing for that. We can come back to it. Jacob Chansley, this so-called QAnon shaman, was sentenced to 41 months in prison for his role in the U.S. Capitol riot. The Justice Department had asked Chansley to receive a harsh sentence as a way to set an example among the January 6th rioters. Yeah, the guy was a figurehead. I really think that's the only reason they hit him like that. Two men who for decades steadfastly maintained their innocence in the 1965 assassination of civil rights icon Malcolm X were set to be exonerated on Thursday after nearly 2-year-long reinvestigation. Muhammad Aziz, now 83, and the late Khalil Islam were convicted in 1966 after a trial in which authorities withheld evidence favorable to the defense, said their attorneys, the Innocence Project's and civil rights lawyer, David Shaney's. Wow. In international news, the head of the Women's Tennis Association has cast doubt on the email released by Chinese state media attributed to missing tennis star Peng Shuai. The former #1 ranked player has not been seen or heard from over 2 weeks after posting allegations against the country's former vice premier, Zhang Doli, on social media. She alleged she was, quote, forced into sexual relations with Zhang, who last held office in 2018 and was a close ally of Xi Jinping. The email, written in her voice, says the allegations are false and adds, "I've just been resting at home and everything is fine."
And people are speculating, of course, that that's not actually her writing the email and that she's been detained or something, or, you know, is being held, whatever.
They're trying to say basically somebody's forging that email to make it look like she's okay.
Because she's making an allegation against the, again, former vice premier, you know, big person in the country.
How's her last name pronounced?
I would,
G-O-U.
I would guess Shawi, but I don't know.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm not sure.
Sex offenders convicted of multiple rapes could face chemical castration in Pakistan after lawmakers on Wednesday passed new anti-rape legislation that aims to speed up convictions and impose tougher sentences. It comes in response to a mass public outcry over a recent surge of rapes against women and children in the country and growing demands to ensure justice for victims of sexual assault. Yeah, the more I think about it, the less I have an issue with that. In China's hypersonic test of a hypersonic missile over the summer went around the world. The second most senior U.S. general said in an interview released Tuesday, shedding new details on the test and warning that China might one day be able to launch surprise nuclear attacks on the United States. Wow. The Philippines condemned in the strongest terms the actions of 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels which blocked and used water cannons on 2 Manila supply boats on their way to the Philippine-occupied atoll in the South China Sea, its top diplomat said on Thursday. Foreign Affairs Secretary Theodoro Lorson said no one was hurt during the November 16th incident at the second Thomas Shoal, but the Philippine boats, which were transporting food supplies to military personnel based there, had to abort their mission. In business news, the Staples Center is getting a new name after 22 years. Starting Christmas Day, it will be called Crypto.com Arena. Crypto.com is paying $700 million, according to multiple reports, over 20 years to rename the building. The parties aren't publicly announcing the financial terms of what's believed to be the richest naming rights deal in sports history. And in holiday news, we have a few. Apple Cider Day, that's always good. Great American Smokeout, even better. Married to a Scorpio Day, no experience with that. Mickey Mouse Day, and of course, Mickey and Minnie Mouse's birthday, Disney properties. You guys are listening to the Fault Lines. Those are your headlines. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So one of the interesting things, too, I want to hit on, COVID. So part of the reason that you might have this number of deaths or people committing basically drug overdoses, many of those people were at home, working from home. In addition to working from home, you have a lot of people who ended up being depressed. Either from the COVID situation, the inability to get out of the house. You may have what is thing called SAD, seasonal affection disorder, where the people basically aren't able to get into the sunlight in the day, so they feel like their life is somehow curtailed. And in that situation, you might have had more people using drugs. I mean, I'm not sure what else was going on at the time that could have incentivized that level of death. And I don't necessarily think that level of death is normal within the course of, a year. From drug overdoses, but I could be wrong. I mean, I don't necessarily know the typical number of people who die over the course of a year from drug overdoses, but 100,000 just seems so high. And from May 21st to April from May 2020 to April 2021, COVID. It's like in the middle of COVID. I mean, what are your thoughts? Is that something that's abnormal? Or is that, because sometimes I have a hard time justifying, like, okay, is this normal or abnormal? And I know it says normal for that many people to die for drugs feels weird, but it's just the reality of life, right? I don't know the normality in that number, but that number seems high.
It's normal, but it's getting worse. It's normal in that, it's been like this, but no, the numbers are going up, and it's like exceeding population growth.
Yeah.
I want to just briefly go back. You said people being inside, why people might be abusing these drugs. You're like, having to stay inside. But you said something. I'm sorry, I'm a nitpicky person.
Season affliction disorder?
I'm a nitpicky person by default. But you were like, something about their life being curtailed. It's not just their lives being curtailed. It's like they got to get outside for vitamin D and stuff. You know what I mean? It's like that's seasonal affective disorder. That's a big part of it too. And I know that people specifically, random tip, not saying I'm a medical doctor, but I know people who have seasonal affective disorder who have successfully either mitigated it or treated it by having certain classes of lights indoors where they just like load lots of lights. And it's not just like Christmas lights, although I know some people have tried that. It's literal
specific kind of light.
Simulating UV light, that kind of thing. So you get that sense indoors and vitamin D production. Anyway, brief tangent on that. Again, a little bit nitpicky, but
it can't be the only, I mean, you can nitpick, but it is accurate. Their life was being curtailed based on the COVID stuff, where they weren't necessarily able to get.
No, totally. I guess my point was that it's not just a matter of, I prefer to be outside. It's literally medical health. You want to get sunlight. Yeah. You want to get vitamin D. That's like a sort of prerequisite for a fully functioning body. That's my point. It's not just, but again, nitpicky. Regardless, my thoughts on the general thing, it's normal, but it's been getting worse. 100%. We talked about this earlier, and so I don't want to rehash too much. Fentanyl specifically is the synthetic opiate that a lot of people are targeting as the main cause of this new sort of spate of diseases. Where my mind goes to look at it from another perspective, and I was thinking about this earlier. For all the time and money we spent on COVID, this is the kind of thing. It's like, okay, are you more likely to treat an acute condition that suddenly shows up, or this chronic condition that's consistently dragging your life down? If you sprain your ankle, you're like likely to change your behavior in a certain way. You're not going to walk on that foot. On the other hand, if you have type 2 diabetes and you sink into it over the course of years and you realize, okay, I'm getting less and less healthy over time, whatever, you're not as likely to treat it necessarily because it's the analogy of the frog slowly boiling in the pot of water or whatever. You're just used to it. I think there's a similar case can be made. A lot of people are making it about all sorts of things in America as it relates to COVID. 100,000 people died in a single year. Over 100,000 people died in a single year. Now, that number may have been smaller years earlier, but it's still a big number. And cumulatively, that's a lot of deaths. And the deaths are just the tip of the iceberg, because for every drug overdose you have, there are hundreds or thousands of people who don't have that overdose, but who are abusing it, whose lives are permanently, for the duration of their use of it, diminished and contained by the dependence on it and the craving for it, that kind of thing. That stuff is real. And again, tip of the iceberg, how bad it actually is for our society. The question comes to mind, what can we do to solve it? Why aren't we making it a bigger priority? Why are politics? I'll put it like this. AOC talking about the cartoon, I agree with her on the one hand, but on the other hand, isn't this just a continuation of the Democrats' thing of making everything about how evil the Republicans are for saying stupid things, doing stupid things, instead of focusing on solving people's actual problems, which is dying from synthetic opiates flown in from overseas, sold to them, dying from those, dying from poverty, dying from lack of access to good. You know the idea. It's like, I don't want to diminish the idea that, yes, Paul Gosar was completely wrong for posting that, and he behaved abhorrently both in posting it and in the way that he defended it by basically not really apologizing at all and just focusing on immigration and doubling down.
Statement.
On the other hand, why is that the news cycle for a day or two in the DNC? Why do they allow themselves to be distracted by these petty marginal things?
So she shouldn't bring up the fact that he made a cartoon about them.
No, but the DNC, both the DNC and the RNC should be healthier. And for the DNC to really make some progress and actually, I don't know, get the gains that it wants so it can beat the Republicans, it shouldn't get fixated on browbeating this guy for doing something idiotic. He shouldn't be elected again, but this shouldn't be the habit, the default of the Democrats. It's just focusing on this culture war stuff and how Republicans are idiots, which often, guess what, both Republicans and Democrats often are, as people are.
Personally, I think people can walk and chew gum. And the situation of, we shouldn't bring up one thing because of other things. I mean, that doesn't really take you anywhere.
Are they
doing both? All over the place.
Are they doing both, or are they just doing the culture war stuff?
Well, again, should they just not bring up other issues that pertain to things that you don't particularly care about.
No, I think they should bring it up and then
they brought it up.
Summarily.
You're basically attacking them for bringing it up.
No, that's again, what I literally said was they should bring it up, make it a point of getting it done with, and then make that about 1% of what they're working on instead of 100%.
So they shouldn't have censured him for this?
I just repeatedly have said, no, they should have.
Okay.
But they shouldn't have. There shouldn't be the kind of
you're saying
tactic.
two things. That's all.
No,
it sounds like you're saying two things. You're saying
I think I'm saying something a little bit more
Democrats
nuanced.
shouldn't do X, Y, Z.
I'm saying this shouldn't be their default,
etc.
This shouldn't be. But the nuanced take that I'm trying to get across repeatedly here is this should not be their default. This stupid culture war, petty grievance stuff. Even though I admit it's dangerous for Paul Gorso to be doing that kind of thing. If that's their number one priority, is browbeating the opposite side instead of getting things done for Americans, that's the wrong priority. That's what I've said.
Okay. Well, everybody heard you. You guys are listening to Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to our guests. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So in March 18, 2019, an F-15E streaked across the sky and dropped a 500-pound bomb on a crowd. Immediately after, another jet, tracking them, dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on the people who basically survived the killing of the first people in the first bomb strike. Well, somebody, an analyst, looking at this, said, "Who dropped that?" and typed in a secure chat that they basically killed or dropped a bomb on 50 women and children. That analyst was actually wrong. The number was much higher than 50 women and children. They were going after quote-unquote terrorists and ended up basically killing 50 or 60 women and children. To have a conversation about, and by the way, not just killed, hid after the fact. The New York Times did an editorial on this that basically revealed details of this particular strike called the Bazooz Strike. And it was one of the largest civilian casualties that took place in Syria over the course of that conflict. To have a conversation about this and other issues, we're joined with Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Scott, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today? Scott, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Oh, there you are. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good, thanks. Yourself?
So far, so good. So when this article came out, there was the previous strike that killed all of those women and children where Biden was basically trying to take revenge for the suicide bombing that took place. And I remember at the time where Biden said, we're not going to forget, we're going to remember, that oftentimes the people who they're going to go after the fact, there's no way to know whether those people were actually responsible for the thing that they're accusing them of. Or in this very specific situation, you had basically women and children killed. And clearly, they weren't the ones that were responsible for the suicide bombing. Well, I made the point back then that that's a feature, not necessarily a bug, And you have this case with a bazoo strike where they've basically killed all of these women and children and then basically hid the fact that they did so. Is this the largest, I guess, amount of killing or let's say death that took place in one strike? And tell me if I'm wrong on this. This seemed to be more of a feature and less of a bug, meaning this is more normal than anything else. This is not something that's basically abnormal, as deplorable as that is.
First of all, it's not the largest deaths. Even the United States acknowledges, for instance, in the battle for Mosul, we dropped a bomb on a building and killed over 100 civilians. In the battle for Raqqa, we oftentimes dropped bombs that killed dozens of civilians. It's systemic right off the bat. Let's just acknowledge that it's systemic. One of the problems here is when we talk about the law of war, which is what we're talking about here. Because look, first of all, let's just acknowledge war is hell right off the bat, and urban warfare is even more hell. It's very, very difficult to wage an urban conflict, where combatants are intermixed with civilian populations and not kill significant numbers of civilians. This is called collateral damage, and it's one of these tragic things that's accepted by international law as in the inevitability of conflict. Now, there are things that a party to the conflict, must do to mitigate against this, but it's impossible to mitigate against it totally. Right off the bat, it's going to be very difficult for someone to successfully press a case of a war crime having been committed in any of these conditions, even the one in Baghouz, because at the end of the day, it comes down to the state of mind of the people ordering the strike.
Really?
Did they believe that it was a military objective, and had they done their due diligence to ensure that this was a military objective without a disproportionate number of civilians being killed for the military benefit expected from the strike?
Scott, let's pause on that for a second because that's big. And let's look specifically, of course, at the article that we're talking about. 70 deaths they thought at the time. Pardon me, 50 deaths they thought at the time. Later updated to quite a bit more than that. Closer to 70. There was shock inside, and that's part of the focus of the news article from the New York Times. Shock inside by people spectating what happened. Like, why did you weren't those women and children? Why did you shoot that? Doesn't that indicate that there wasn't, in terms of the mens rea thing, that they hadn't prepared competently enough, basically that they hadn't done their due diligence, Scott?
Well, first of all, the people watching it were analysts, not the war fighters. They had no say in the strike being made. Second of all, they were watching a high-resolution video that was not available to the people making the strike at the time. So, no, New York Times is comparing apples and oranges here. We don't really care about the people that are watching this remote in Qatar because they are not players. They are not in the chain of command. They don't have a strike authority. Eliminate them from the proposition. As difficult as that is, that's reality. They would never even factor in a trial.
Wait a minute. How can they? I mean, if the analysts aren't the ones who are making the decision on who to bomb, and if the analysts have access to basically high definition, where they can say, hey, those are clearly women and children that you guys are basically bombing, why is that not relevant? It looks like they would be, at the very least, in part of the information gathering aspect of it. I mean, the war fighters, shouldn't they have this level of information to know who they're actually dropping their bomb on?
Well, the problem is, the difference between sufficient information and sufficient time to strike. This is a problem that emerged when the United States first came into the ISIS fight in 2014. How do we get U.S. military aircraft to drop bombs on targets, when you don't have U.S. military forces on the ground engaged in combat? Normally, we have this great military resource called a Joint Terminal Attack Controller. It's a specially trained, usually Air Force special operations guy who is trained to be on the front line to identify a target, to confirm that the target is a military target, and then to work with the various fire support agencies to bring down appropriate fire on the target to achieve a desired result. But it requires American eyes on target and American voice talking to American assets. But when President Obama said, we're not engaged in combat, these JTACs had to go back into what's called a Joint Operations Center, removed by hundreds of miles from the front lines. So now we bring these, what we call ISR assets, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance asset, drones, including high-resolution drones. We have special reconnaissance aircraft. We have other abilities to gather information, and the JTAC is now remote viewing the battlefield and identifying targets using these resources, and then communicating to the American aircraft who would then drop a bomb. The problem is the Iraqis on the ground, the guys doing the fighting leading up to Mosul, are saying, it's taking you far too long to drop the bomb. The enemy is gone by the time the bomb hits the target, or they've killed my men. And that's neither one of those situations is good. So a decision was made, it's called Joint Directive Number 1, to push the JTACs out of the Joint Operations Center forward, not on the front line, but sitting in the next command post back together with the Iraqi commander. And now the JTAC it has more flexibility. And the other thing they did is they issued something called an ATAX, which is basically a Samsung tablet downloaded with an app that had a photograph, high-resolution photograph of the battlefield, and it was gridded out. And this was given to an Iraqi. The Iraqi had a translator, and the Iraqi would go forward, find a target, and using this high-resolution imagery, and it would say, okay, that's building A32. He would contact the JTAC and say, we need to strike A32. The JTAC would evaluate available resources and then pass this information up to the aircraft. Meanwhile, being monitored by a one-star general back in the JOC who confirms, yeah, that's a good target, solid target, or hey, wait a minute, we need to get more information on this. But then again, even now is considered too slow. So what they did is they gave the JTAC immediate release authority if the Iraqis are in contact with ISIS. So now the one-star general's out of the picture. The Iraqi looks at the image, says, we need to bomb that building. The JTAC does a quick research of the imagery, says, drop the ordnance, it's hit. And that's what we did in Mosul. Now we go to Syria, where we're doing the same tactics now. We brought it in, but we don't have highly trained Iraqi special forces on the ground doing this. We had the Syrian Democratic Forces, a terrorist organization, because that's just basically the PKK renamed. We had an American general tell him, if you want American military assistance, you can't be called the PKK because the Turks call you terrorists. They said, well, we'll become the Syrian Democratic Forces. Hey, that's good with us. Here's the weapons. We gave them the ATACs, and now they're going forward. And there's an interesting article in the New Yorker magazine about the bombing of Raqqa that talks about one of these Syrian SDF guys going forward. And basically, as he advances down Raqqa, he's dropping a bomb on every building. And the guy's going, hey, there's no resistance. Yeah, but there could be a sniper, so I'm dropping the bomb. You see, what happened is the Syrian is calling up his JTAC, saying, I got resistance in this building. The JTAC says, you're in contact with ISIS. He authorizes the bomb to be dropped. They don't do any more of that checking and balancing stuff. And so now we come out of Raqqa, where, by the way, we slaughtered 1,600 civilians. The U.S. military only admits to 159. We killed 1,600. We come out of that battle. We now start moving against the ISIS people that are in the villages along the Euphrates, ending up at Baghouz. Who called the strike in Baghouz? It was not American eyes on target. It was an SDF commando who called in the bomb strikes. And because he claims to be in contact with ISIS, the JTAC authorized the strike to occur. That's just the way it was. That was the lawful rules of engagement.
Well, Scott, it says there was an American Special Operations Unit called Task Force 9, which was in charge of ground operations in Syria. Is this the group that you're referring to?
Task Force 9 is Delta Force. Delta Force is training the SDF and providing some assistance, but Delta Force is not permitted to engage in combat. The airstrike was called in by a Syrian Defense Democratic Forces forward controller using the ATAC system, contacting a JTAC who is part of Task Force 9, and they brought in the strike. But remember, we don't have officially troops engaged in combat. Now, there are some exceptions. For instance, if Task Force 9 was told to go after a high-value target, then they can. For instance, when we raided al-Bakr and we killed him, that was Task Force 9, Delta Force, going in there, launching a direct action mission. But the fight against ISIS, you could have Task Force 9 advising the Syrians, but the strikes had to be called in by the Syrian Democratic Forces. They were the lead, the conflict lead. And so they used these tablets with imagery to call in strikes. And what happened here, what specifically happened, to show you how complex this is, as the Syrian Defense Forces were pushing into Baghouz, they were being hit by wave after wave of suicide attacks by the diehard ISIS people. They were taking heavy casualties. Initially, the U.S. tried to suppress the suicide attacks by bringing in drones with these Hellfire missiles. And so as the ISIS fighters swarmed against the SDF positions, we were firing Hellfire missiles, taking them out. We ran out of Hellfire missiles. So now, as the SDF is pushing, they see a massing of people. The number of people killed in that strike was 80. 16 of them were armed ISIS fighters, confirmed, without a doubt. There were another number of them that they're not sure of. And then I think the remaining 54 or 64 were women and children. But the ISIS people said, we believe the women and children are armed. And that's why they were bombed. And you know what? Unfortunately, in this complex battle of ISIS, women have been armed. Children have been armed. Now, I don't believe for a second that the SDF saw weapons in their hands. I believe the SDF just said, we're tired of being killed by these fanatics, and we're just going to kill them all now. Now, is that a war crime? Could be. Could be, because you're not allowed to let your emotions overcome. But there's, at the time the strike was made, all the JTAC had available was the low-resolution video. He didn't have the high-resolution video, which was controlled by an intelligence resource outside of his chain of command.
Yeah, the SDF on the ground, sort of giving the request or placing the order, that kind of thing. But what do you do about this, Scott? It's almost. I will back up for a second. It's the problem with waging a war against a civilization and culturally trying to reform governments, this kind of thing, trying to de-religionize whatever governments. Is you're waging a war against an entire culture, and for various reasons. And insurgent warfare, the whole thing is it becomes total warfare pretty quickly with suicide bombers coming out of nowhere, and you're doing an occupation of a country, and you suspect any person on the street, man, woman, child, adult, whatever, of potentially harboring murderous attitudes towards you. It puts you in a situation where these kinds of things, and shortening the chain of command from seeing a target on the battlefield to, okay, let's see this, and we got to hit it as quickly as possible. Limited span of opportunity. We can't wait for this whole chain to deliver this order, place this request for somebody thousands of miles away. I get the sort of problems with that, but those problems, using all the problems of drone warfare, they seem inherent to the kinds of wars we're waging in some sense. These total wars, these occupation-style wars, where we're effectively doing government reform operations. That's where my mind goes, Scott. But what do you think I might be missing here?
No, you're not. I mean, first of all, I think we have to understand, and it's very difficult for people who haven't been there to understand the difference between what should be happening and what is happening. We can sit back in air-conditioned offices and come up with rules and procedures that conform with international law and everything. You try to apply that in reality, and people die. Your people die. And it only takes you going to a couple funerals where you have a pair of boots and a rifle in the ground where somebody's dead, and you say, how do we prevent this from happening? Because as a warrior on the ground, my job is, at the end of the day, to keep my fellow warriors alive. And if we're being swarmed by an enemy that whose tactics are by design created to overwhelm our normal tactics. We have to apply abnormal tactics, and it becomes an absolute war for survival. A lot of people don't realize that the Syrian democratic forces took horrific casualties. It's not like these guys were sitting back doing nothing. They were closing with the enemy, ISIS, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. These weren't cowards, but they were getting slaughtered by suicide bombers. So, how does it? There's a book about the Vietnam War. James Hare wrote it, called Dispatches, and he one line just jumped out at me. Charging a man with murder here, he said, is like writing speeding tickets at the Indianapolis 500. And that's sort of where we're at in this kind of horrific battle that's taking place, where we can sit back here in New York Times offices and in Washington, D.C. offices and say, oh, my God, that shouldn't have happened. But on the ground, there literally was no alternative. I'm not saying that we should have dropped that bomb on those women and children. What I'm saying is I'm not going to second guess what was going through the minds of the men on the ground who were dying and watching their friends die. And they were engaged in heavy conflict with a fanatic enemy that was using women and children as combatants and also using them as human shields, which is a violation of international law. But any delay on my part, any hesitation on my part to apply lethal force to a threat that I've identified could result in me being killed and my friends being killed.
Yeah, lives lost on the ground. I know, I hear that completely, and that's why I was, listening to everything you were saying, and it makes sense, as of course you do every time you talk to us about the inside out of how this stuff, we've had a conversation with drone strikes with you before last time, and you gave us this great illuminating inside out view of what that looks like and the problems with it. And where my mind goes with it is I see all the problems you're describing, they're practical problems on the one hand, but then if I zoom out for a second, I'm like, there's this larger problem, which is what you're having to deal with there, it's based on the kinds of wars we're waging. It's based on our kind of foreign policy. I'll put it like this. It's not just, okay, if we're not at war, we don't have to deal with this kind of thing. If we're not occupying other countries because we want to reform their governments, then we don't have to deal with all these problems where you can't disambiguate a combatant from a civilian, et cetera. And for another thing, just having the chain of command so removed where we're fighting all these wars overseas, it extends that process. It makes the links of how many people you need to make that request go through it. It just tarnishes that process. Now, you have an article out on RT.com, Jamarl. You found this article. I wanted to make sure we got this in.
Yeah, you basically made the point of saying Biden's foreign policy is built on a big lie. I love that. What is the thesis of this particular article that you're trying to get across about Biden's policy in regards to not necessarily being the most truthful thing in the world?
Well, Joe Biden, let's just start with the immediate. Joe Biden has come out in his interim national security and said American democracy is the shining city on the hill. He didn't use those words, but
Reagan's whole line,
is going to rally behind. The savior of the world today is American democracy. And, we're going to go sell this. We're going to get the world to rally behind it, et cetera. So right off the bat, we start with, America is the greatest thing in the world. We are so exceptional. The world is going to follow our lead, and they must be like us to succeed like us. Then we have Tony Blinken going out there and saying over and over again that what makes the world work, besides having America as your leader, is the rules-based international order. This agreed-upon mechanism that's been in place since the Second World War that makes the world function fairly and freely and effectively, and we're defending the rules-based international order, and we're promoting it, and we seek to impose it. And anybody who's against it is against, the normal functioning of the world in accordance with the freedom that comes from American democracy. Okay, I see that too. But then you have Jake Sullivan come out and talk about China. And he says, look, we don't want to go to war with China. What we want with China is a competition where we make the rules and the rules solely benefit us. And I went, that's the most honest thing the Biden administration has said.
Very honest.
Stuff is garbage. This other stuff is garbage. Democracy isn't the shining example for the world. The world today overwhelmingly rejects American democracy as a functioning model of efficiency. It's a laughing joke to much of the world. Many people would like America to function as a normal democracy and are saddened by the fact that we're not. But even our closest allies are looking, saying, hey, there's problems here, man. You got to fix this stuff before you start trying to export it. the rules-based international order, everybody recognizes that it's there to solely benefit the United States and its allies. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. And Jake Sullivan's statement is the most honest thing out there. So, but we're not promoting Jake Sullivan's little, slip of the tongue. We continue to promote Biden's, vision of American democracy leading and Blinken's embrace of the rules-based international order. It's all a lie. All a lie. Everything about our foreign policy is a lie, except this one little statement that Jake Sullivan said that nobody's paying attention to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember the Tillerson memo came out and basically strongly made the point that the entire point of American foreign policy is that to paraphrase, if you're backing us, then you're great. We're not going to do anything about it. However, to use human rights as a club to basically hit our enemies. And so you have a country like Saudi Arabia on one hand, but you hit Iran or you hit China and you use human rights as a cudgel to do it, as opposed to our other allies who might be pretty much the same in regards to the way they regard human rights. Well, you leave them alone because you don't want to have more enemies than friends. I think that was one of the main theses of the thing. But you're right. I mean, that seems to be the policy that many American presidents go by. In fact, every other American president that I can think of during my lifetime used that same language and used that same rhetoric. They didn't necessarily say rules-based order. That seems to be a new phenomena. But from the standpoint of we're the shining city on the hill and we're the leaders of the world, we're the indispensable nation, that type of stuff, that seems to be part of the propaganda and the way that these guys push that sort of rhetoric about this kind of idea or this image of America. Not necessarily true. Scott, thank you, my man. I always appreciate these conversations. The voice that you guys are listening to is Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Pelly having a conversation about the Catholic bishops and Joe Biden.
Austin Pelly.
Yeah, Austin Pelly.
Former producer on the show.
Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined on the line by Austin Pelly, former producer for this show, and a current producer over at Political Misfits, although that's not the end of it, but I can't say the rest of it. There's a happening that I referred to, I think, earlier this month or last month, when you were still with us on the show, Austin, and that happening has not yet happened. Anyway, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I've been better, but, thanks for having me, guys.
Good to hear.
They were thinking you weren't feeling that well, right?
You were not feeling well.
Yeah.
But it was, explain it, Austin.
We were sure if it was COVID. I pretty much have all flu-like symptoms, but fairly certain it's just like common cold. So
makes sense. I don't hear any coughing, which is a good sign. But better safe than sorry. Let's get into it. We brought you on, and of course, thanks for joining us. Always good to talk with you. Been a little while, but not too long. Let's get into it. We're talking about Catholic bishops approving a document, basically supporting the idea of denying communion to Biden. And we've talked with you before. Pope Francis and Biden had their closed-door meeting. Conspiracies about which were spread. I might come back to that. But they had their closed-door meeting. A lot of people were wondering at the time what's being said. Of course, it seemed like it was going to be kept private, but people were wondering what's coming next, because there had been widespread dissent among conservative Catholics, specifically in the U.S., who were saying Biden, even though he says he's a Catholic, basically has all these messages, all these things that he's promulgating as a Catholic that run contrary to the tenets of the religion, as they say it at the very least. Anyway, can you explain, right up front, what is this document? Is Biden going to be denied communion? Maybe even explain briefly what communion is in a little bit of detail, Austin.
Yeah, so communion's our most important sacrament. It's having the body of Christ and being able to do that is the most important thing in our faith. So this meeting was not an ecumenical council, but it was of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So it wasn't necessarily called by the Pope or sanctioned by the Pope. Not to say that it goes against him to do that, but it's funny, this group of bishops are the same group that puts ratings on movies. So that way, if you're a Catholic parent, you can say, like, can my kid go watch Deadpool, or is it way too graphic and way too profane?
So that, wait, and what did they decide with Deadpool?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay, go for it.
Well, they rate it based off of like an actual age, because frequently like, PG-13 would mean, you know, 13, but a lot of times they're like, well, you should be like 18, because a lot of this stuff is pretty bad. And then they rate it by age and like how morally valuable it is. But this is the same group of Catholic bishops that basically decided and voted 222 in favor of empowering priests to deny public politicians or politicians who publicly denounce core Catholic beliefs to deny the Eucharist to those politicians, and only 8 were opposed.
Wow.
So overwhelmingly in favor of this vote, that it just gives more power to priests that otherwise would have said, well, unless he's officially excommunicated, I don't want to do that.
Wow, that is significant. I mean, 228 to 8 is, you know, brutal. It's weird. For some reason, I'm somewhat surprised that they were willing to do this. Oftentimes, there's this kind of separation between, look, I get it that in real terms, how a person functions politically on some level is going to depend upon how that person sees the world in a spiritual sense and in this kind of sense of philosophy, morality, et cetera, ethics and all. And sometimes that's tethered to this kind of religious bearing within an individual, or, you know, how they were raised and everything else. But for some reason, I often feel like there's a separation between politics and religion in a way that they don't necessarily cross paths. Well, in this case, I mean, they're crossing paths significantly so. I mean, the abortion thing, yes, I get that there's a religious aspect to it, but it's predominantly a political issue. And they're basically saying, based on this political issue, this particular guy shouldn't necessarily get communion because of it. So what are they going to do now? Are they going to deprive Biden of communion? He's going to have to change religions because of his political points of view?
No. So Catholic, by definition, means universal. So even if there's no such thing as falling too far from the faith. You can always come back. But as he's publicly supporting one of the core issues that the Catholic Church is against and is vehemently against, because there is no gray zone when it comes to this. There are certain morality questions that you could ask, like the difference between, I guess, having gay tendencies versus acting on those tendencies might be like an issue that you can talk about. But for Catholics, like, abortion has been the number one, super cut and dry. You have to believe in life at conception.
But what about pedophilia? For some reason, that's not cut and dry, or that's something that's allowed. But Biden, because of his approach to abortion, that's off the table.
Catholic culture war coming back up.
I mean, I'm just making the point that it's pretty rich that an institution that was basically raping kids and then passing, you know, the priests around without them going to jail and everything else, that this is the group that is passing judgment on the president of the United States because of his beliefs in abortion or gay marriage.
It could get fiery. I'm just saying. Austin, what's your take?
No, it's just because something happens, it doesn't mean that the organization is in favor of it. It's like saying...
Something happened for decades. And the institution itself, meaning this wasn't just one or two, this was something would happen with a priest where they would molest several kids, and then they would move the priest to a different area because they didn't necessarily want to push that person in regards to prosecution. All of this stuff hit the media all at once, where you had years, altar boys coming forward saying, yes, this guy did it. And it was in the thousands.
The Pope didn't kill himself.
The Pope didn't kill himself.
It's a horribly edgy joke. A horribly edgy joke. But I'm a serious point. I'm sorry, Austin. You didn't relate. But my point here is, can't we make the same argument about, like, seriously, the Epstein network brings up weird questions about our own government agencies. I'm hearing about the Catholic Church, and I'm not a Catholic, never planned to be one, but you know, I don't have any particular aversion. And this idea that I agree, yes, serious problems. It seems like they're kind of coming to terms with them right now in this long drawn out process. But other networks you can make that argument about too. And to Austin's point, I don't know that that actually contradicts the other arguments. It's a kind of ad hominem attack, in my view.
How's that an ad hominem attack?
Because it's like, okay, your point is, it's saying you're a hypocrite, basically, which is an ad hominem. The point of whether abortion is valid or not that has nothing to do with, it's the same.
It's not an ad hominem. The point that I'm trying to make is they're basically passing judgment on Biden as this is one of their core concepts, so much so that they're going to say, we don't believe that you're Catholic enough, or we're, for the most part, going to undermine your ability to have these kind of aspects of Catholicism while simultaneously protecting a lot of men who are basically raping kids. Now, you could say it's ad hominem. I think the raping of the kids is the attack, per se.
Like Bill Clinton, potentially.
Yeah.
Or Donald Trump. I'm just throwing that.
However you want to call it.
Austin, we've been going back and forth. Austin, what do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So it's not that easy. It's the Catholic Church has always condemned pedophilia, whether or not that, like, as an institution, they've always condemned that. At no point has it ever been condoned, and especially like the Pope and the heads of the Church have always believed this. Whether or not the actual practices of the priests and/or local bishops adhere to that, they can't exactly watch every single one of them. But also, like, when you find that out, absolutely they should have been they should have been defrocked, which means you're not a priest anymore. They should have been even brought to the authorities to have that issue dealt with. It's just a core belief of, if you believe that because a bad practice has happened in an institution, if you believe that institution is fully corrupt. You can make the same argument with police departments. I'm of the belief, and so are many Catholics, that the Catholic Church as an institution is not corrupt. You just have to weed out the bad that was in there. And same thing with like bad police officers. So I don't think it loses the overall value of the institution. And yes, there's work to be done. And it's actually better that it became in the public sphere, because now you can publicly demand action be taken so it never happens again.
In both cases, and I'm going to pivot to another side of this, because, again, the whole pedophilia thing, I feel like it's a bit of a rabbit hole and kind of not directly related to it. But in both cases with the police and the Catholic Church, you say bad apples, you make that argument. But it's like, I'll use the metaphor, it's like a bad strain or something like that. It's not just, it's just some actors, because clearly in both institutions, there are trends going on there. There are reasons these things are happening pretty consistently. I'm not trying to say everybody in them is bad. That's where a lot of the nuance gets lost. But it's this idea that there are, running through these institutions, there are strains of bad behavior. And it's not the whole tree, it's not every apple, but it's enough of them that you should take notice. But there's this other side of it that I wanted to go to, relating to denying communion to Biden. This was a general letter on political leaders, right? You were saying it's not, I don't know specifically in the language of the letter, but you didn't bring Biden up. That Biden's name did not come up in the letter. It was general language about denying communion to political leaders, whether you could do that. So what I wonder about is, are we going to see a spate of politicians suddenly being denied communion? Is that going to become a factor? In other words, Biden might be what people are thinking about, but are we going to see other cases too? Austin?
Yeah, they very much could. It's no doubt that this letter was brought to this conference because of Biden, because it's hot in the news. But it would be, I guess, I want to say political suicide, but they try to not be so political, the Catholic Church, to openly condemn Biden in this letter. Like, it would just be, how could you do this? Like, it would be bad news.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the U.S. Catholic bishops seem to be at least now, some of the most conservative in the Catholic Church, period, which is kind of butting heads against our most progressive and most inclusive Pope that we've had so far. So I think the Catholic Church overall isn't going to make any statement on Biden whatsoever, but I believe it's Bishop Wilton Gregory, of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., said that he would not deny Biden communion. So it really depends on what church you go to. I think if Biden was to travel out to rural North Carolina, he'd probably get denied, but as far as it goes in D.C., he's probably still good.
Wow, that would be huge if they denied a president communion. That would just be shocking to me.
Could he, it's not excommunication and even excommunicate. Would he still say that he was a Catholic? That would seem like to be such a big thing that it's almost like he would have to take a step away from the religion or be seen as a hypocrite. Austin, we've got less than a minute. What's your take?
Yeah, I think he would. I think he would just take it with a grain of salt. I don't think he would make any public big deal about it. He tries to go to mass and not make a public big deal about it because he knows that his politics directly conflict with his faith. So
he knows that he doesn't want to broach it too harshly, so he wouldn't make it into a political thing. Because I could see Democrats wanting to go conservative Catholics or something like that, but he might just want to avoid it entirely. Interesting. Austin, always good talking with you. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying yourself over at Political Misfits, and I hope you feel better. Thank you for speaking with us this morning. And for those listening, that was Austin Pelly, former producer for this show, now over at Political Misfits, still, of course, with Radio Sputnik, the network. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning's show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning and one of the last hours this week of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, everybody, good morning once again. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It's November 18th in the year 2021. And Jamarl, how are you doing?
So far, so good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Decent show today.
Absolutely. I'm trying to make... It's the Brady Bunch, but with Rick and Morty on your T-shirt. Is that what I'm seeing right? You got those 9 square panels. Jamarl's, he has these Rick and Morty shirts, and I'm pretty sure... I think that's what it is. It's the Brady Bunch.
Yeah, it's like the Brady Bunch, but Rick and Morty instead. Yeah.
All these characters arrayed in like this...
My wife got me this.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, she every so often she's like, "Here's another T-shirt." She knows I wear them a lot.
That's awesome.
But yeah, Rick and Morty.
Fantastic. All right, let's get into headlines here. First up in COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 114,361 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,603 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 88,140 cases per day. That's an increase of 23% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 69% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,390,239 people across the United States. It has killed 766,206 people here in the U.S. In national news, the House of Representatives voted yesterday, to approve a resolution that censures Representative Paul Gosar and strips him of his 2 committee assignments. That's the first time a sitting House member has been censored in more than 10 years. The action led by House Democrats represents a major rebuke to the Arizona Republican for posting a photoshopped anime video to social media showing him appearing to kill Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and attacking President Joe Biden. Apparently, that anime clip was from the anime Attack on Titan, right, Jamarl?
Yeah, Attack on Titan.
Never saw it. I steer away from anime because I hear it's so good that, like a black hole, if I get drawn into its presence, my whole identity will just get stripped apart, and suddenly I'll be a weeboo.
It kind of is. My ex-girlfriend, my wife, both of them love it. Yeah. And so my wife would just be sitting there watching anime, and of course, as you're sitting there, you're like, what happened with that? Who's that? And eventually you're just sitting there watching it with her. Like she just drags you into it.
That's how it starts, kids.
Attack on Titan was one of the best ones. It was a phenomenal show. I think there was 2 seasons. People wept at the end of the first season because it was taking so long for the second season. It's exceptionally good.
I grew up watching, and it's like kind of lame anime from everything I hear, but my mom used to do these as unschooled as a kid, and sometimes I'd work with her. She would do these DVD transcriptions.
Yeah.
So basically, she'd be watching a video, she'd be watching a DVD, and just like working on the hardware, syncing timestamps up and stuff. But anyway, she was working on these different things. And Inuyasha, this anime series Inuyasha, I watched that.
Inuyasha.
But I kind of, it's a little bit of a lame one, but I liked it growing up.
Yeah.
But and then there's one that I need to catch back up on, the greatest of all time, some random friend of mine said to me, what is it? Serial Experiments Lane, which is apparently an extremely seminal anime, super like cyberpunk, very innovative. Animes in general, brilliant, I hear.
They are.
Major cultural force in America,
Adult themes and everything else. This is very weird stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Attack on Titan was really good. Full Metal Alchemist, that was another one that I got that I ended up loving. Yeah. And Bleach. But there was one more. There was one more that I mentioned once before.
There's Neon Genesis Evangelion. I know that Evangelion. I know that's a popular one.
I've seen it, but I haven't necessarily.
Death Note. I know that's a popular one.
Yeah, Death Note was good.
Is that the one?
Death Note was good.
Because they're doing all those live action versions of it.
Yeah, the live action version sucked.
That's what I hear too.
Yeah, it was horrendous.
Again, they
had like a white guy playing an Asian character in Death Note. It was very weird.
Yeah.
But no, the Death Note, the series, was quite good. Like, quite involved, very,
that's
intellectual in the ways.
Exactly, the intellectual stuff. It's like this sci-fi that you don't, again, it's animated, and so you have more latitude creatively to put your art universe in there. It's not as expensive as live action stuff. And so whether it's manga or anime, I know there's this deep backlog of like rich sci-fi ideas that's super cool. Cowboy Bebop, I started to watch with Jack recently. Never really got too into it, but I know Cowboy Bebop, they're making like a live action version of it. And it just doesn't seem as good. I see people criticizing it.
Yeah.
Like criticizing the shots and just being like, this looks lame.
It just looks
I don't know that they can actually do the anime to live action thing successfully. It might be, I don't know.
Attack on Titan didn't go too bad. They did a live action Attack on Titan movie that they were actually playing in the movie theaters. That was pretty good. But I think that was like the best that I've seen. The Full Metal Alchemist looked weird. My wife was like laughing at it as it was going on. She was like, what the hell is wrong with that guy? Like she was just like, his comments on the side.
Now you and I can get back to arguing about Gosar and AOC. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to keep going with headlines here. Julius Jones is scheduled to be executed today at 4 p.m. Central Time. That's unless Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt grants him clemency. Jones is sitting in prison for homicide, even as widespread support calls for a reconsideration of the case. Even as the clock is winding down, the Republican governor has still not said whether he will accept a recommendation from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, which voted 3-1 on November 1st to commute Jones' sentence to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Jones has received support from the public in the form of a petition with millions of signatures, over 6.5 million this morning, last I checked. That petition is calling for a reconsideration of the case before Jones is due for execution today. It's also received public support from celebrities and public figures, including Kim Kardashian. She was the biggest name I saw on that list. Provisional data from the CDC shows that over 100,000 people died from drug overdoses between May 2020 and April of 2021, with drug death nearly doubling in the past 5 years. Synthetic opiates are still seen as the leading cause of drug overdoses, blamed for nearly 2/3 of the deaths in this latest 12-month period. Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman, was sentenced to 41 months in prison for his role in the U.S. Capitol riot. QAnon shaman makes him sound too cool, dude. He was like a Braveheart wannabe, Druid wannabe. I don't know. I don't mean to hit him too much because I'll be honest. I wish I had the cojones to walk around and like bare-chested with blue paint on myself, wearing the wolf head thing.
Yeah.
It's not even my aesthetic. I just wish I could pull that class of fashion off. I don't know. That's serious.
It was pretty bad, can we say, bad butt?
Badass, you can't say that. You can't say that.
Yeah, I think it was pretty badass. Yeah. I mean, whatever you want to think of it, clearly, I don't necessarily like the fact that they did
the dude's politics or whatever. What he's doing there.
But I respect to, going in like that.
Yeah, admittedly, me calling him a Braveheart wannabe, that's just jealousy. Anyway, two men who for decades steadfastly maintained their innocence in the 1965 assassination of civil rights icon Malcolm X are set to be exonerated Thursday. That's after a nearly 2-year-long reinvestigation. Muhammad Aziz, now 83, and the late Khalil Islam were convicted in 1966. That's after a trial in which authorities withheld evidence favorable to the defense, according to their attorneys, the Innocence Project, and civil rights lawyer David Shanies. In international news, the head of the Women's Tennis Association has cast doubt on an email released by Chinese state media attributed to missing tennis star Peng Shuai. The former #1 ranked player has not been seen or heard from for over 2 weeks after posting allegations against the country's former vice premier Zhang Guli on social media. She alleged that she was forced into sexual relations with Zhang, who last held office in 2018 and was a close ally of Xi Jinping. The email, written in her voice, says the allegations are false and adds, quote, "I've just been resting at home and everything is fine," end quote. Yeah, sounds pretty false to me. If she makes an accusation, if she makes a big allegation like that, and then all of a sudden you don't hear from her, and then a couple weeks later she's like, "Oh, I'm fine. And by the way, that allegation was false," and she doesn't really say anything, and she's just like, "Yeah, I'm just gonna be in private now." Yeah. That's not her, or at least if that is her, it's under coercion, right? That's the idea here.
It sounds bad, yeah. That's the idea that they're pushing, yeah.
Unless I'm misunderstanding something about it.
Because we've seen stuff like this happen before. Not specifically like this, but I remember one of the other cases where the Amazon killer where, well, they call him an Amazon killer because he would buy products from Amazon. He would be honest about like this, this is great at putting a lock on to keep people confined in a building, etc. Like, yeah, he would just tell out, he was like, this knife is great for stabbing your neighbors or stuff like that. But it would be real stuff that he was actually doing with the items that he was getting from Amazon that people were like, okay, this guy's just funny, he's just making fun. No, he was actually being serious about what he was using stuff for. But in one of the cases, he sent a message, or he was sending messages for somebody who was missing. And he was basically saying, hey, I'm doing okay, guys. I'm doing great. I just took a vacation. And after a while, people were like, dude, what did you do with the real person?
See, Brian Laundrie should have done that with Gabby Petito.
Just like
that's the real trick.
Yeah, tweets and stuff like that.
He's like, she's talking to her family, and he like steals her phone, and he starts texting them with it.
Like, hey, I'm good, guys.
I just need some time to myself in the Arizona wilderness forever. Anyway, or not Arizona, it was Montana.
I know what you mean,
Wyoming, Grand Tetons. Anyway. In international news, continuing on with it, sex offenders convicted of multiple rapes could face chemical castration in Pakistan after lawmakers on Wednesday passed new anti-rape legislation that aims to speed up convictions and impose tougher sentences. It comes in response to a mass public outcry over a recent surge in rapes against women and children in the country and growing demands to ensure justice for victims of sexual assault. The second most senior U.S. general said in an interview released on Tuesday that China's test of a hypersonic missile over the summer went around the world, quote unquote. That sheds new details on the test and warns that China might one day be able to launch a surprise nuclear attack on the United States. And, you know, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Amazing that you went to that first.
That's what, well, yeah, but that's where we go pretty often first, too, is we're thinking, what was this going to turn into, man? And I'm not, again, I don't know. We have those same capabilities, and the idea that any possible threat to us, i.e. the rise of any other power, is inherently an evil because we are inherently a good, I understand that kind of thing, but I don't think the American empire is good for Americans first and foremost, and I see pushing back against China, not in every way. I don't like China in a lot of ways, but the rabble-rousing for war is just military industrial complex agitprop in large part, as far as I can tell, and there's a more moderated position. I don't know. Anyway, the Philippines condemned in strongest terms, quote unquote, the actions of 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels which blocked and used water cannons on 2 Manila supply boats on their way to a Philippine-occupied atoll in the South China Sea. That's according to the Philippines' top diplomat, saying that on Thursday, today. Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin said no one was hurt during the November 16th incident at the Second Thomas Shoal, but the Philippines boats, which were transporting food supplies to military personnel based there, had to abort their mission. In business news, Staples Center is getting a new name after 22 years. Starting Christmas Day, it will be called the Crypto.com Arena. And when I saw this, I was like, wait, is it April Fool's Day? Crypto.com is paying $700 million, according to multiple reports, over 20 years to rename the building. The parties aren't publicly announcing the financial terms of what's believed to be the richest naming rights deal in sports history. I will come back to that. In holiday news, today is a lot of cool stuff day. It's cool headlines. I like the headlines. I mean, I like the holiday headlines we have today. It's World Philosophy Day. It's Use Less Stuff Day. And it's National Rural Health Day. Those are like my kinds of headlines. I mean, my kinds of holidays. Today's a great day in my opinion. Anyway, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So Staples Center, LA-based basketball stadium that I grew up hearing about, and I don't think I ever went there. Staples Center, now known as Crypto.com Arena. And I saw this, and my first thought, and it's the one that probably a decent number of people have had, is like, wow, how cyberpunk. Something like that, like, whoa. But then my next thought was, actually, this might be kind of lame and not all that cyberpunk. This might be like the cyberpunk that TV wants us to think we're living in or something. Because Crypto.com, if I look into it, it's literally Crypto.com. It's not like some super cool alternative cryptocurrency thing.
It's a website, right?
It's just, well, it's a website, but it's like the most prominent crypto website, at least in terms of top-level domain name recognition or whatever, literally Crypto.com. Formerly known as Monaco. I'd heard about it. Clearly, they have a lot of money to be throwing around for this. But this is the side of crypto that makes me depressed about crypto. It's like and I hear people defending NFTs, but it's the side of crypto that seems to me non-revolutionary and merely more money laundering or something like that. It's like,
explain. What do you mean? Because they're buying the center name, or because of just the way they do their business?
Yeah, I'm speaking about this pretty generally. Okay. Sorry about that. Crypto.com. Here's what I mean. My hopes for crypto, along with a lot of other people's hopes, almost a decade ago, back in the early days, was that it would turn into this big revolutionary, actually alternative banking phenomenon. Now, that was a hope. I didn't have real confidence. I didn't invest in crypto because I was like, I don't see how this fledgling thing in the long run, I don't see internally, politically, how they're not making a consistent case to me about in response to government intervention, in response to governments trying to get involved in all these various ways. How are you going to make sure that doesn't happen? It's I think a lot of people who look at this after enough time, they're like, okay, that becomes the real problem. What are governments going to do about it? So that was my thing back in the day. And what a lot of people have seen is the revolutionary elements of cryptocurrencies and the crypto space in general. I would argue a lot of people, I've heard people make this argument recently, are being more and more subverted into merely money-making opportunities where you have, whether it's a Ponzi scheme with any new crap coin you find on the street, and I can't, SH something T coin is what a lot of people call them, any, not good quality, whether it's a random money-making scheme, and I'm not hitting people who do it, or whether it's like an NFT, just this abstract
non-fungible token,
non-fungible token, this abstract recognition that you own something. A lot of money, tens of millions of dollars in some cases, getting spent on these things. But what is it? What is it? And what does it do? It's not a DAO. It's not a distributed autonomous organization that's trying out some new way of organizing society. It's basically virtualized art sales. And art, as a lot of people know, specifically the more lucrative sales of art, it's just money laundering. It's just a way for rich people to park their investments in something, either so they don't have to show where they got that money because it's illegal and through tax loopholes, or it's just a way for them to make an investment, save on taxes, maybe do some charitable donations on the site to make up for it. My point is crypto is drifting into what seems to be just another co-optation by the elite, specifically the financial elite, continuing all the problems that crypto was built to fight. This stupid financialization, I would argue, of society and domination by these, completely detached elites making monetary big currency choices for the rest of us. That's what pisses me off about it, is that it feels like the crypto that's winning is the bad kind of crypto and the self-defeating kind of crypto. But
the revolutionary crypto being basically pushed to the side. Type of stuff.
Hopefully that makes more sense because admittedly I was super abstract before. But
that makes sense. I didn't understand where you were going with it. No, that part makes sense. But basically, you thought this was going to be more revolutionary in the way that they were trying to either sell it and use it.
Exactly.
And it became
But now some big crypto.com website, and I looked into it, it's not doing anything all that cool. Guess what? They bought the Staples Center with a $700 million, estimated whatever purchase price. That's a lot of money. What is that money actually doing? People are parking their money in that, not to try to change society, and I can't blame them for it exactly because utopianism has a problem, but for advertising and because it's just a way to make more money. I don't know, man. That's my... It's like the romanticism of like, we could have done something with, and this is what it's turned into. There's that bit of sadness about it.
No, I understand that. I feel that way about rap. I believe it or not. I mean, you at one point you had these kind of two strains of rap where you had gangster rap and you had more conscious rap, so like a Public Enemy, KRS-One. Never was a fan of KRS-One, but still KRS-One. You had a bunch of these guys where at one point, maybe in the 90s, early 2000s, you had two strains where, if you didn't want to hear, I went to this place and killed this person and shot that person and this woman is a B and et cetera. Well, you had the other stuff. That other stuff has gone away. You just have the gangster rap stuff.
No, there's still plenty of people doing that kind of thing. It's just not necessarily as popular. Conscious rap is totally a thing.
I mean, I remember when Will Smith ended up doing a hard rap video. But that's kind of my point, though. Like, if for Will Smith to feel like, all right, in order for me to be relevant, I need to now dress in black.
Jump on this bandwagon.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you look at who owns the label owners, and that I know is a big thing in terms of who's actually making the money. Dr. Dre doing his own thing on the West Coast. I mean, maybe.
Dr. Dre used to wear lipstick and lace. He used to wear like these glittery outfits and everything else.
But he had his own outfit, is my point.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, a friend of mine actually went to work for and produced for Dr. Dre. A complete, just throwing that in. I have this weird connection. But my point is, like, all these different inequities in the rap industry, I hear you on that, and I hear you on the sort of bifurcation, and it does match of, like, on the one hand, you have, okay, what this could have been, and then it's just people jumping on the bandwagon to profit off it. I don't know, I hear that. But also, with rap, and, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I feel like there's this other narrative, which is you can have both, too. You can have enlightened... Well, I don't know, enlightened rap that's a lot of people would still think of as gangster rap. You can have like deep messages, like deep symbology, deep imagery that resonate with people. They're very intelligent and profound in their own way. And I, that can be embedded in what might seem like just a violent message or whatever. There can be some real stuff there. You know what I mean?
Sometimes those things become few and far between, though. I mean, one of my favorites, Can I Bus, lyricist like nobody's business, phenomenal. At putting rhymes together and everything else. But that stuff seems to be, less less prevalent than it used to be. It just seems like it's going in a particular strain.
I can see that maybe.
Yeah. I don't doubt that you can find somebody who's been doing it for a while, who's still within that. I don't want to get into this title rap and everything else.
Well, and counterpoint, because we were talking, conscious rap and stuff. I don't know. I know him mainly as like an incredibly competent writer.
Yeah.
But MF Doom. MF Doom, the recently deceased rapper, like part of, I think a lot of people know him because of Mad Villain, his collaboration. Anyway, my point is he's like a pretty well-known dude who died recently. A lot of people were paying tributes to him. Tarif Simon, calling him from New Orleans pretty regularly, he called in to pay tribute to him. My point is, I think of him as a more conscious rapper, mainly just because he's an incredibly intelligent dude, obviously, in terms of his writing. My point is, there is like this preservation. A lot of people do like that stuff still. Yeah. It hasn't died out completely. That's my only note of optimism, is like there is still this strain that I hear.
Yeah, it's still there.
Real things.
No doubt. I'm pretty sure they're there. Yeah, and it's funny, when I was younger, I was heavier into the more violent, the more, I don't know, the showboaty, et cetera. And as I got older, I was like, oh, geez. It kind of like the Harlem Renaissance. What I realized was, in the same way the Harlem Renaissance had this kind of positive benefit of saying, oh, wow, blacks can write this, and they can think, and they can do this, showing society that these things were positive attributes, or for that matter, the Cosby Show. I know Bill Cosby has basically fallen into disrepute now, but at the time, you had all of these African Americans going to school, wanting to go to these historical black colleges. Well, the same thing is true on the other side. I mean, in the same way that those things could be, spurring the individual to be higher or greater than themselves, you can also have stuff that spurs people to be less than themselves.
That's true.
And things that they represent that aren't necessarily the greatest in the world.
It's true. But you have De La Soul, and you also have Wu-Tang Clan, and I like both of them.
I like both. Yeah.
My own way.
Yeah.
Let's go into a break, though. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be coming back in just a minute, speaking with Daniel Lazar, talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, politics in America, revisiting some stuff we were talking about earlier this morning. We're talking about a bunch. Anyway, back with Daniel Lazar on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area or just so happen to be in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So the other day, the New York Times has this awesome opinion piece. And it basically says, how did so much of the media get the Steele dossier wrong? Now, that's somewhat of an interesting question, right? For 3-4 years, these guys have been running with the notion that Donald Trump was working with the Russians in order to undermine the election of Hillary Clinton, and that Trump was basically an animatronic robot for Vladimir Putin, who was putting thoughts in his head and getting him to do all these things. And you find out several years later that they were wrong, all the way through wrong. And you found that as various people who were considered to be sources were basically prosecuted, showing that what Steele was putting out was basic nonsense. And yet various media actors and political actors ran with that nonsense and even made their careers off that nonsense. So the article goes in and basically asks the question, how did the media get it wrong? And they basically make all of these excuses as if, well, they couldn't help but get it wrong. Well, nonsense. Not everybody got it wrong. I didn't get it wrong. Shane didn't get it wrong. And that was before we even worked here. I want to talk about this and ask that question. How did they get it so wrong? To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Daniel Lazar. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as critics of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I love this article. As I went through this article, part of the question comes up is, well, how did we get it right? Meaning, I wasn't working for any of these institutions. And I remember when this first came out, I had my channel. And I was basically saying this is nonsense. These guys don't have anything to show for this. And yet they're just repeating it over and over and over again. And there were even like WikiLeaks items that came out with Clinton and people around her basically saying, use the Russians to go after Trump. Now, the catch becomes that stuff was out there. You even had one of the Richard Engel, reporter on Rachel Maddow. This was back during the beginning of the election where Engel specifically told Maddow, we get all of these reports and they keep telling us about this stuff, but there's nothing to show for it. And we've tracked it down. We've even said, well, just give us the evidence so we can run with it. But it is shown to be nothing. That didn't stop Rachel Maddow for the next 3-4 years to come up with one story after the next concocted, but, you know, basically implicating Donald Trump in some kind of wild conspiracy, Tom Clancy-esque thing with the Russians. It was bizarre, to put it mildly. What are your thoughts on this? How did they get this so wrong? And why didn't we get this wrong? What's the difference in those things?
Well, I mean, I think the reason they got it wrong is that Russiagate, very simply, was an attempted coup d'etat.
Agreed.
They thought that if they could, hit Trump with all this stuff about Russian collusion, he would eventually give in, crumple under the pressure, and resign. The record is really quite clear on that. I mean, when James Comey confronted Trump with the Steele dossier, especially the famous golden showers incident that it describes.
Can we ever say that with a straight face? Is that going to be one of those things in history that people just are like, whenever they talk about it, they start chuckling?
It's like Trump was so angry at Obama that he had a prostitute basically pee on the bed. It's like, are you serious?
It's just years later, and literally every time it comes up, we still chuckle.
Yeah, so salacious.
Anyway, Daniel.
It brings us back to Bill Clinton, Lewinsky, and that famous cigar.
Yep.
Monica Lewinsky and that famous cigar. But anyway, I was in Spain that summer when the Lewinsky scandal broke, and people were making jokes about that cigar from Madrid to it was unbelievable. And now the golden showers is what everyone remembers from the Steele dossier. But it was clear it was an attempt to drive Trump out of office. Steele showed his dossier to a neocon named Kramer. I forgot his first name, who was an aide to John, the senator from Arizona, John. Help me out here. Anyway, so he was
McCain.
Yes, and he wanted to, and the idea that he would show it to Trump in an attempt to get Trump to resign. And that was clearly the intent behind all these actors, like James Comey and John Brennan and others. And it didn't work. But in order to keep the threat going, they had to maintain this story in unison. And so the press, after being fed details by the CIA, and now we know from top Democrats, kept the chorus up. Trump was a colluder. He was a person who had been put in office by the Kremlin in order to advance Kremlin policy. And the Steele dossier was a major article of proof. It provided a backbone for the FBI investigation. Yet we now know the Steele dossier was not a hoax, but it was nonsense from beginning to end. It was filled with glaring inaccuracies, contradictions, non sequiturs that anyone should have recognized from the beginning, but that the CIA and FBI kept going. So that's what happened. I mean, the press, was, the pro-Democratic Party press was seized by enthusiasm with the idea of using this to drive Trump out of office. That was the first coup d'etat. January 6, 2021 was the inevitable follow-up, and we'll see more in the future as the American system continues to destabilize.
There's this other thread that came to me literally just yesterday after a New York Times article came out the day before. And it's the kind of thing that I feel I should have been thinking about for a lot longer, but sometimes you see something and it strikes off a set of thought processes. But I'll come in and can't come in on it like this. Headline of the New York Times article, basically, the West is responsible for most of the decline in democracy around the world. I'm paraphrasing slightly. But in other words, Western-aligned countries are drifting into more authoritarian directions. And, institutions locally, traditionally associated with democracy, like universal access to voting, for instance, or non-politicized, non-biased courts, impartial courts, those kinds of things are on the decline. And mostly it's happening in Western countries. And here's how I'll come in on it. It's like the friend who, whenever somebody brings up, whenever they get the inkling that they might be responsible for a problem, there's like this psychological, pathological kind of response where they blame it on somebody else. And they immediately assume that somebody else is victimizing them, or that it's their parents' fault, or that it's society's fault, or something like that. And of course, there are cases in which, yes, these problems actually are your parents' fault, or it actually is society's fault. In a lot of cases, it's just your fault. Now, that seems like a non sequitur, but here's how I'll relate it. I would argue that our diplomatic and political establishment in America specifically, but in a lot of countries in the West, has had that same knee-jerk, sort of reflexive, deferring of responsibility response. And that Russiagate, another way of looking at it, was that was what happened with it. We blamed Russia for pivoting, for turning not just American democracy, but also we associated them with Brexit. We argued that Brexit was a Russian thing. It was a Russian-backed phenomenon associated with Bolsonaro, too. I remember that coming up. There was this idea that Russia was responsible for this wave of anti-democratization to the point where the Washington Post changed its tagline to democracy dies in darkness, referring, of course, to Trump, but through Trump to Russia. In other words, here's the point that I'm making. I see Russiagate now more and more, as I think about it, as a sort of cognitive reflex of Western elites, intentional and unintentional, I'd say both, to pin on an outside force, this other nation, this big Cold War enemy of ours, all the problems leading to American decline, to a decline in how well our government works. And because we can't fess up to it, because maybe we don't know how to solve it, maybe there are too many entrenched interests to solve it effectively, we basically pin it on Russia, this outside force. And that's a large part of what Russiagate was. It wasn't just turning on Trump. It was turning our own eyes away from our own problems, basically. Daniel, that's where my mind was going with this stuff. What do you think about it?
Well, I completely and totally agree. The article, by the way, ran in yesterday's Times. It was entitled, U.S. Allies Drive Much of the World's Democratic Decline Data Shows.
Thank you.
It's on a study by a Swedish nonprofit called VDem, which the Times then fact-checked and essentially ended up supporting. And what it shows is that the decline of democracy is not something that Russia and China do to us. It's something that the U.S. is doing to itself. And yes, completely. Russiagate, which is an attempt to blame the America's electoral failings on the Kremlin, is a prime example. Exhibit A of this process of how democracy is collapsing from within. Totally.
Very interesting. You know what, Daniel? We got other stuff to talk about. Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Let's go to that for a minute. Big trial, riveting a lot of Americans' attention, and it's like the whole bated breath. People are red in the face for holding their breath for days, waiting for this verdict to come out as the jury continues to deliberate. A lot of people, we've been having conversations on the air. Basically, I'll go to you for sort of high-level appraisal of it before we maybe get into some of the specifics and what's actually going to happen here, basically. High-level appraisal is, I see the judge is admittedly a bit biased, but the prosecution completely bungling this in terms of the points they're making, how they approach things, how they talk to the judge, just completely bungling it. And the supposition that I made, and I think a lot of people were making, is surely the jury is going to acquit, especially with the withdrawal of this misdemeanor charge. Surely, with these killings, the jury is going to acquit. But maybe I'm in a bubble, maybe I'm biased. I'll just go to you first. Daniel, watching this case, what's your take?
Well, first of all, I just will not make a prediction. Juries are unpredictable. and I'm not going to be so foolish as to try to second guess what they're going to do.
I will go where angels fear to tread. I will be the fool, Daniel.
I'm just too cautious. I've been burned too many times. But I agree. I mean, the defense is in trouble, certainly. The problem is, to me, the issue is really the Second Amendment. I mean, there's so many guns in this country, and when people bring them to, in the old days, you had a protest, and it could get a little wild and woolly, and the worst that would happen, some people would be arrested and maybe roughed up by the cops. But now everyone comes to these things armed.
But in the same way, the first dude, Jason Rosenbaum, the first dude that Kyle kills, he was like out threatening to chase after people and cut their hearts out. And so if you're talking about a shift in, okay, America's protests have gotten worse in these different ways, that seems like that's not just, I don't know, protesting in the square. Chasing after people and threatening to kill them when you find them one-on-one, when you have them cornered, that's not standard protesting tactics, but that seemed to represent some of what was happening during last summer when those protests got more fiery. And the rioting, you can't blame the people who are going to that level. You can't say that's about guns, can you?
Well, yes, but one of the people that Kyle Rittenhouse ended up shooting was himself armed. I mean, there was a demonstration, a Black Lives Matter demonstration in August in Austin, Texas, in which some self-appointed vigilante security guard armed with an assault rifle. When protesters made their way onto a highway, the guy somehow felt obliged to approach a stalled car with his rifle in hand, and the motorist then shot him dead.
I remember that. I remember seeing the video. Yep.
Yeah, instances like this happened numerous times during the BLM protest. You can't have a protest anymore when everyone's armed.
But wait, if we're thinking of the same institute, the incident with the dude in the stalled car, wasn't the other guy literally wielding like a katana, like a sword? If we're thinking of the same thing, the video that I saw.
Well, the incident I'm thinking of, the person who was shot dead was wielding an assault rifle.
This is kind of the problem, right? There are all of these issues where this guy has a weapon, this guy has a sword, this guy has a katana, this guy has a gun.
So coming back to anime, are we really about to outlaw katanas? Think about the millions of young Americans. I'm just kidding.
But yeah, I agree with you, Daniel. It is somewhat of a problem. I mean, you go to a protest, and then people are armed at these protests. And many of the BLM protests, you had like trucks having supplies, weapons, that people were basically picking up in order to have these kind of weird street fights that were taking place at various points across the U.S. I know you don't necessarily want to give a verdict on this, so fair enough. It looks as if the prosecution is having somewhat of a hard time in this case. I'll put it that way. But why do you think things have devolved to this degree? I mean, we've had our issues before in this country. Back in the 70s, you had like the Breakfast Club. Not the Breakfast Club, I forget, it'll come to me in a moment. But people setting bombs during the Vietnam War and those type of things during protests.
Black Panther, Weather Underground, Black Panther Party with their breakfast program. Is that kind of where your mind was?
The Weather Underground. Yeah. But not like this. This seems to be different to me. This seems to be something distinct and separate. Why have we devolved to this degree? And maybe that question is too broad, but I'll ask it anyway.
I think the nation is very polarized, obviously. There are huge numbers of weapons. There's more than one weapon per adult in the United States these days. There are huge numbers of weapons. People are coming to these protests armed. They quickly devolve into shooting wars, and there was although people don't like to admit it, there was a good deal of violence and property destruction by BLM protests. So therefore, you put that together, it's inevitable that some self-appointed vigilante army would take shape to defend property against the threat of BLM activists, torching it. So that's what Rittenhouse did. And the guy is still associated with far right-wing militia groups.
Associated, but what do you mean by that? Associated?
Well, his photograph was taken with one of the militias, I believe.
That was that night, but there were people he hadn't met before that night. He showed up with friends of his, and there was this militia there that was like kind of adamantly doing the right-wing militia thing, and going back and forth with the protesters. But during the trial, he came out multiple times and was like, I didn't know them. I didn't really spend too much time. There was a single picture, but that was basically the association. The overlap was these dudes decided to come out also to defend the same car source, the same car sales lot, basically. But they didn't know each other. He didn't know him before that night. Yeah, he has his own weird background. His TikTok account, name of which is 4 doors more whores. What? And then the bio or his tagline of which is just, bruh, I'm just trying to be famous. So he's his own weird dude who Matt Gaetz apparently now wants to bring on as an intern. But as far as I know, he doesn't have any associations with right-wing militias.
Wait, but you're saying the right-wing association came after he did the killing?
It was completely...
They had no picture. When did he take the picture? After the killing?
It was the night of.
Okay.
The night of the killing, they all came out to defend the same lot, but they had never met before. They had no prior contact, as far as I know. This wasn't addressed during the trial, but they had no follow-up contact. Who knows? But certainly pertaining to it, it's not like he was a part of a right-wing militia.
So the picture where he was taking that right-wing sign or the white supremacist sign or something like that,
it was like either
later.
December or January. Either December of last year or January of this one. I just forget which.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's perfectly fine. The political character, the political character of Rittenhouse's intervention still seems to be right-wing. But that aside, I'm just focused on the Second Amendment, and it seems to me that the Second Amendment and the First Amendment are emerging in direct opposition. In other words, the proliferation of guns makes it impossible to have any kind of free assembly, because as soon as tempers flare, as they inevitably will, people start shooting. Then the protest is over.
Well, I think I can understand the general point, but I think if you look at the specifics of this trial, I don't think this would support that idea. But I think your general case, let me try to restate it as I understand it, is that say Kyle Rittenhouse, just look at it sort of super superficial. Kyle Rittenhouse goes to this protest. There's a protest going on. He brings a gun. He shoots people and gets off with it. Well, that's going to have a chilling effect on other protests in the country, certainly, right? If somebody can just go to a protest, start shooting people and get off, certainly that's going to have a chilling effect. I can see the argument. But if you look in the specific case, and this is why if I were on the jury, I would vote to acquit based on the defense and prosecution going back and forth with him on the stand specifically. He went out and it was self-defense. He went out there trying to provide emergency medical aid and put out fires, and he did at different points during the night. There are fires that you can see him putting out as he carries a fire extinguisher around, and there are people who had been injured. One person who'd strained or broken her ankle, couldn't walk, had a hard time walking. I think it was a sprain. Who he put a splint on, helped to get her reacquainted, that kind of thing. Now, he also showed up with an AR-15.
Right, which is the point.
If America had effective gun control and he didn't have an AR-15 and none of the other protesters had pistols, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
If a brawl might have erupted. Some people might have gotten beaten up, which is of course extremely unfortunate, but no one would have wound up dead.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with Shane on this one. I do agree that maybe the ways that this was covered, and I even agree that the prosecution seems like it's having a grotesque hard time trying to get this case through, and he probably gets acquitted off this, just based off what I've seen and the people who I've talked to who weren't necessarily fans of Rittenhouse. But there is something disturbing about a kid basically taking it upon himself to take a weapon and go to a particular scene. I mean, and even though the picture that he took for the right-wing thing took place months ago or months after the thing took place, so what? He still took that picture.
He still took that picture, but it doesn't pertain to the events the night of.
No, it doesn't pertain to the events the night of, but it does go to a temperament, or at the very least, a perspective that the person is holding. Otherwise, why take the picture with a bunch of...
And I'll put it like this. I agree that the over-reliance on weapons in the street is a problem, and I agree that relying on vigilante justice is a problem. On both counts, I agree with you completely. But what I think everybody should be asking is, and you got to it slightly, Daniel, and this is the right-wing take, why did he feel that it was necessary? Why did you have a complete lawless state where in Kenosha the night before you had fires running amok? Half his family in the city, he's thinking my dad lives a couple blocks away from this strip. Why does he feel that some random 17-year-old feel he should take it upon himself to go out with a rifle, an assault rifle, to defend the city? Why were the police not there? Why were mayors across the country ordering police to stand down and not protect their city? Was it merely so they could avoid getting any egg on their face? Avoid any potential blame, because maybe some police pushed a protester too hard or something. In other words, wasn't it just the mayor and the governor's cowardice in these different states? And I'm, obviously broad indictment of a lot of what was going on last summer. Wasn't that part of the real problem? And shouldn't we include that in the conversation? Not just Second Amendment rights versus First Amendment rights stuff. There's another side to it too, right?
American policing is a scandal. I mean, remember, what started this whole thing was when a cop in Minneapolis killed George Floyd in full view while people are screaming at him to stop, to let the guy up, and they just killed him, suffocated him over the course of 8.5 minutes?
Yeah, it was like 9 minutes of putting the knee on the man's throat and basically choking the guy to death. The guy was calling for his mom. The guy was basically saying, "I can't breathe," and Chauvin didn't particularly care, him and the other 3 cops that were around him as he murdered him.
Yeah, so and this stuff goes on all the time, not just to black people, by the way. Let me emphasize.
That's true.
That's right.
To poor white and Hispanic people as well.
And natives. I want to include Native Americans in the population. It's not just for woke points or whatever. It's seriously, lowest rate of shootings, lowest rate of homicides as far as I know among Native American population in terms of shooting police, lowest chance of shooting back, the highest chance that police are going to shoot Native Americans. In other words, there's this complete asymmetry, and I feel like that's a part of it. But go for it, Daniel.
But police. So policing is a scandal, and so there was a huge eruption at these over these kinds of abuses, and then the cops then pulled back. They didn't know what to do. The whole much of the country was exploding in rage. The BLM, if you recall, was getting very positive poll results. They're telling half the country was expressing support for these demonstrations. And so, the cops pulled back. And then, people started lighting fires. And then people started, coming to these protests with assault rifles.
And threatening to hunt people down and cut their hearts out?
The country exploded.
Yeah.
When a country explodes, this is what happens. We've seen it in other countries, and now, we saw it in the United States. That's when you talk about, we talked before about the crisis of democracy and it being, essentially homegrown. This is an example. America does not have a competent police force. It cannot ensure the security of its citizens in a democratic manner. Okay, because the cops, whenever they do these things, they do it in a highly abusive, racist, and brutal manner.
By and large. I feel all these caveats because I'm trying to be fair here. Enough of the time that you need to take notice and you need to do something about it. But I just want to be cautious about, not going to hyperbole and being every time or even most of the time, because it doesn't need to be most of the time for it to be a problem. But Daniel, thank you for joining us. I really do appreciate every time we talk with you. It's always great.
Thank you.
And for those listening, that was the voice of Daniel Lazar, writer, author, journalist, columnist. You can find his work a couple different places. You can find his work specifically, weeklyworker.co.uk, also strategic-culture.org. He's also written a number of books, including The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Follow him on Twitter at DHLazar. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into our break. Coming back, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Back in just a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Let's go now to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Thank you, gentlemen, for taking my call for free drone science, hands off Haiti. Free danger. I have 2 comments. First comment is dealing with the Gray Zone came out with an article. So I think it was yesterday, dealing with some files that was leaked, talking about how the Australian government was ignoring the abuse of Julian Assange, that they wasn't standing up for him. So it's a long read. It's a long article that's good to read. It's pretty long, but please, people, check it out. It's by the Gray Zone. My second comment is dealing with Secretary Blinken went to Kenya. It was basically asking them to join forces with the rebels, the so-called rebels that's fighting against the Ethiopian government and the Kenyan.
Are you serious?
So the Kenyan State Department rejected them. So Kenya rejects Secretary Blinken intervention in real time, and says the solution must come from within.
That is amazing. That is amazing.
I'm sorry. I was listening, but I think I misunderstood you. Tarif, you're saying that the Kenyan government is basically reprimanding Blinken in the United States for supporting the TPLF, right?
Well. You say, Kenya. What I'm reading is the Ethio-American Development Council, and they have this woman. Seems like she's part of the Kenyan government. Is explaining that Ethiopia should Ethiopia should be its own country, its future, nobody else.
Wait, so you're saying that Blinken was basically asking the Kenyan government to get involved in the conflict with the TPLF in Ethiopia with the idea of getting on the TPLF side?
Basically, trying to get them to
recognize the TPLF government as like the government.
Really?
Wow. That's insane. Tarif, thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, that's about it.
All right.
I've been to Ethiopia.
Tarif,
I've been to Kenya. And I remember they were talking about the way that I had the opportunity to talk to one of the cab drivers, Uber drivers, and he was taking me around to different protests and stuff like that. And he was saying himself how the Kenya has a relationship with the U.S. government where they would get troops from Kenya to put into different zones, war zones. And because of the poverty level and everything else in Kenya, basically you're selling somebody, I give you money if you come to do X, Y, Z. And I was like, dude, are you serious? He says, I can show you the bases here. I can show you images and pictures of my friends wearing a U.S. uniform. He says, yeah, this is basically what happens. And so these kind of relationships with the U.S. and these other countries, that's probably where that's coming in from. That's amazing.
It's disgusting. Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that that at least that one person, hopefully it's representative, that they're pushing back on it. Tarif, thank you for the call. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let's go now to Nathan calling in from Detroit. Nathan, saw you were going to call in. What's on your mind this morning?
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm calling in about your segment you guys did with Austin. He was saying that no pope has ever supported or concealed child sexual abuse. So isn't that the whole reason that Ratzinger stepped down? That it was exposed that was what he was doing the whole time he was a cardinal?
I think that's a cardinal, though. I think that would be the point, is that...
Yeah, but I mean, then he was pope. So the papacy has never done it. That's dishonest at best.
And look, from my standpoint, and the way I look at it, you basically had an institution that in any other situation would be like a RICO case of an institution that was basically protecting various priests that was doing this stuff. I mean, they were moving these guys around so they wouldn't necessarily get get prosecuted by law. And so it's like you had this stuff going for decades of people being harmed and abused by the Catholic Church. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea that all of a sudden they're up at it for political reasons in regards to Biden, I don't know. It feels, thin to me.
The whole cover-up was done by Ratzinger, and that's my point, is that, he was the guy in charge of moving around those priests and helping them avoid prosecution. And to not hold him accountable as Pope and say that, the papacy has never done this, that's a lie.
Fair enough. I want to bring that up next time it comes on then. This isn't something I know about. So thank you for bringing that up. Anything else, Nathan?
Thanks you guys for your show.
Hey, thank you, man. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Calling Austin out. I see. The thing is, I know Austin well enough to feel like I don't think he's going to lie about this, because he will talk about, feel like there are problems.
Oh, I don't think he's lying.
I don't think
he's lying intentionally.
I don't think
he's
lying
just
intentionally.
trying to say that,
maybe there's cognitive dissonance stuff going on or whatever. And, it's weird talking about him, of course.
Not to mention when it's like talking about the Biden thing. Look, I didn't come into the conversation thinking to myself I was going to bring it up. It kind of just happened as we were talking. I was like, are these guys really going to deny, communion to Biden over this?
Yeah.
It came from there. But I do think there's something to say about, how are they taking this particular position like this when they were okay with this other stuff and they allowed this stuff to go on for years. But I don't think Austin is lying. At least that wasn't the take I got. He basically was defending his point, and he was trying to say these things are different. This wasn't something that the church explicitly was okay with, if that makes sense. Like, it wasn't something they were like, we're for pedophilia. Let's, we're the Catholic Church. They weren't doing that. I guess to my point, it doesn't matter whether they were openly saying they were for it or not. It's something that seemed to be part of the institution. But nevertheless, I don't think he was lying. I didn't take that perspective at all.
Yeah.
But I do get your point. What's his name?
Totally. Yeah, no, Nathan. Thank you for the call. And a resident of your chat room, by the way, Jamarl.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
cool.
yeah.
Thank you, Nathan.
I'm not going to give the last name because it's a little bit weird, but I see him around sometimes. Anyway, 202-521-1320 is the phone number if any folks want to join us. We've been talking about a lot today. So there's a bunch that you could call in and talk about if you want to, too. Again, 202-521-1320.
We're still waiting on the Rittenhouse verdict. Bated breath
and we're
on that one.
We're just talking about that. Can we go to the clip? Because we didn't get to, we were talking about other stuff.
Absolutely.
This is relevant to the case, and you brought it up. Basically, the defense requesting a mistrial,
right?
Saying that, and can I set this up?
Yeah,
here?
Go for it.
Because I was watching the full day, and I saw the big event having to do with this.
Mm-hmm. Was this yesterday? This was yesterday, where they requested the mistrial.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Defense requesting a mistrial. Now, it has to do with this drone footage that at a certain point became like the thing that the prosecution was relying on.
Yeah.
Right before Rittenhouse kills Jason Rosenbaum. Joseph Rosenbaum? I keep getting his name. I think I'm getting his first name wrong. Just make sure I've got that correct real quick. The Rosenbaum guy. Joseph Rosenbaum. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Right before he killed Joseph Rosenbaum, there's drone footage of Rittenhouse running, sort of retreating, it's put. And there's this point, and the prosecution was relying on this, sort of is relying on this. There's this point in that video where it's a crappy video with all the glitches you'd expect of a drone video shot from a distance at night. But there's a point where basically the prosecution's saying it appears that Rittenhouse raises his gun as if a threat to trigger Joseph Rosenbaum. Still doesn't make sense to me, but to trigger Joseph Rosenbaum into fearing that there's a credible threat to his life. And so based on that, that justifies his decision to chase Rittenhouse. That's where it sort of falls apart for me. But anyway, the prosecution is arguing.
So I'm aiming a gun at you and you chase me as I aim a gun at you.
Yeah, and therefore it's okay. It doesn't make any freaking sense to me. But anyway, the point is a lot was hinging on this video. And as he admitted it, as the prosecution sought to admit the video into court, there was this deal made about the quality of the video where the defense brought up, hey, this is pretty glitchy video. And sometimes the defense didn't really do a good job of explaining it, but I understand it. Apple has software for its videos where it's not just taking the raw footage.
Yeah.
They also have light neural network AI stuff going on to sort of fill in pixels to improve the quality of the footage, even if the actual camera sensor that you're using isn't that good. So in other words,
had a better version of that video, but the prosecution gave him a weaker version of the video.
Well, I come back to that. The defense is saying that basically because there's this sort of algorithmic manipulation of the video going on, they wanted it sort of rejected. They wanted it pushed out of the court. Mm-hmm. The judge leaned towards siding with them. Anyway, there was this thing brought up about the quality of the video. Now the defense is saying there is a better quality version of that video available, and because they didn't show that video, and they instead showed the lower quality version, which adds uncertainty. Basically, the jury doesn't have access to the accurate information. They have access to inaccurate information that could directly weigh on their choice, ultimately their verdict. And so the defense is calling for a mistrial.
I mean, they even made the point of saying their case would have been different if the video was different, meaning if they would have had the better quality video, that they would have ran basically a different case. They're trying to say that the video directly affected the way they defended Rittenhouse.
Yeah.
And they even, there was like, well, the prosecution is going to can bring the case again. We're not saying it should be dismissed with prejudice, but it should be dismissed. That's the basic argument that they're making on that part.
And here's an interesting thing. I remember talking with Jack the day we were hanging out and I was watching this. He was watching some of it too. Watching the Kyle Rittenhouse testimony specifically when both the defense and the prosecution were talking to him. And there was this conspiracy theory going around, really a theory because it doesn't require conspiracy, but a theory going around on YouTube that the prosecution was aiming for a mistrial without prejudice simply because they knew they had bungled this so badly and wanted to go back around for another pass. So if they get the mistrial, but it's without prejudice, in other words, they could bring this case back, that might be good for the prosecution.
It would be good for the prosecution.
You know what I mean?
Oftentimes, in situations where prosecutions have a double bite at the apple, they get their person.
You get your next chance.
You figure out, okay, this is what we did wrong. Meaning, it's often not advantageous to get that second bite at the apple for defense because the prosecution just gets better at doing their case.
What jury are you going to find for that next trial that isn't aware of the details of the case after all the high profile coverage of it? There's that complication that comes in. Anyway, just interesting developments on that. And yes, Matt Gaetz, Congressman Matt Gaetz, saying that he kind of wants Kyle Rittenhouse as an intern if he gets off, which is just crazy, and him getting optics, whatever, getting publicity for making this controversial statement. And kind of funny one, but whatever. Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are closing today's show out. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. Hope you all enjoyed today's show. See you on the other side.